Hey everyone, welcome to a special installment of Harry Potter Theory. Today we're going to be diving back through the years on the channel and discussing 15 Harry Potter theories that all pertain to Hogwarts Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. The range of theories is pretty broad, and they paint Dumbledore in a bunch of different lights, from his covered-up survival to his secret talents, all the way to his darker motivations. These theories cover it all. As this is a compilation-style video spanning years of the channel, please be aware of some varied audio levels, inconsistent numbering, and some, but hopefully not too much, repeated information. Anyway, without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy 15 theories about Albus Dumbledore. Today, we're going to be discussing a very messed up Harry Potter theory of mine that outlines some questionable actions and behavior from Albus Dumbledore, suggesting that perhaps Dumbledore, wise old lovable benevolent wizard and Hogwarts headmaster, was actually a master manipulator, responsible for the destruction of Lord Voldemort's soul. This theory alleges that Dumbledore, like he did with Harry, raised Voldemort like a pig for slaughter. Now, let me start off by saying that there are dozens of theories out there which suggest that when it comes to Dumbledore, there's a lot more than meets the eye. One of the predominant theories addresses Dumbledore's relationship with Harry Potter, with fans arguing that Dumbledore intentionally raised Harry to be a sacrificial lamb, knowing that Harry would eventually have to die to destroy the Horcrux within him. The theory explains that Dumbledore manipulated Harry's every move, and that he only revealed crucial information to Harry when it was absolutely necessary, potentially guiding Harry towards his predetermined fate. Other theories painting Dumbledore as a manipulative mastermind relate to his relationship with Snape. In the series, Dumbledore was able to convince Snape to become a double agent by using Snape's love for Lily Potter as leverage. Dumbledore was careful to keep Snape's true allegiance a secret from Harry and the Order of the Phoenix, which further allowed him to manipulate events and Snape behind the scenes. But none, at least none that I've seen, showcase Dumbledore as quite capable of manipulating the future Dark Lord Voldemort. But who knows Voldemort better than the man who pulled him out of Wolf's orphanage? And who better to manipulate him than the very man that introduced him to the world of magic? Let's get into it. The first encounter between Albus Dumbledore and Tom Riddle was in 1938, when Dumbledore visits Wolf's orphanage to offer Tom a place at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. During their meeting, Dumbledore informs Tom about the existence of the wizarding world and his magical heritage, and Tom, who had already sensed his own powers, is intrigued by the prospect of attending Hogwarts. At the time, Tom was an 11-year-old orphan who had exhibited signs of magical abilities, but he was also known for his manipulative and cruel behavior towards the other children at the orphanage. On the outside, Tom looked fairly innocuous, but underneath was a brooding dark force that would stop at nothing to cause pain and suffering to others. This encounter between Dumbledore and Tom Riddle is significant because it marks the beginning of their complex relationship throughout the series. It also highlights Dumbledore's role in the early life of one of the most dangerous dark wizards in history, raising questions about the extent to which Dumbledore may have influenced Tom's eventual transformation into Lord Voldemort. Right from the very beginning, from their very first encounter, Dumbledore was cautious and wary of the young boy, sensing Tom's dark nature and potential for evil. Despite all of the warning signs, however, Dumbledore proceeds to offer Tom a place at Hogwarts, hoping that the school and new environment would help shift Tom's life in a more positive direction. At least, that's what we're led to believe. The theory that we're going to be discussing today asserts that Dumbledore, upon sensing this dark nature in Tom for the very first time, began his master plan to manipulate this young boy. When Tom Riddle finally arrived at Hogwarts, he was sorted into Slytherin House, which was fitting as he was a direct descendant of Salazar Slytherin, the house's founder. As he grew older, he quickly became known for his charm and intelligence, excelling academically and becoming a prefect in 1942 until his graduation in 1945. Tom didn't have friends per se, but he certainly did form relationships, with Dumbledore describing his gang as follows. As he moved up the school, he gathered about him a group of dedicated friends. I call them that for want of a better term, although, as I've already indicated, Riddle undoubtedly felt no affection for any of them. This group had a kind of dark glamour within the castle. They were a motley collection, a mixture of the weak seeking protection the ambitious seeking some shared glory, and the thuggish gravitating toward a leader who could show them more refined forms of cruelty. In other words, they were the forerunners of the Death Eaters, and indeed, some of them became the first Death Eaters after leaving Hogwarts. Over the many years that Tom Riddle attended Hogwarts, few were able to detect Riddle's underlying evil nature. Most were distracted by the charm and intelligence he exuded, entirely unaware of what lay beneath. An exception to this, however, was Dumbledore, who kept a close eye on Riddle from the very beginning. Tom may not have acted on his evil impulses like he did at the orphanage, but Dumbledore was more perceptive than that, unable to take his eye off of the boy in whom he detected so much darkness. In 1942, just 4 years after Dumbledore invited the troubled young Tom Riddle to Hogwarts, Riddle murdered Myrtle Warren in the first-floor girls' bathroom and created his first Horcrux. Tom, an avid student with an obsession for achieving any kind of power, spent many of his nights in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library, learning about forms of dark magic that were entirely inappropriate for the average Hogwarts student. It was here that he began to learn about Horcruxes, a form of dark magic which transfers a piece of a witch or wizard's soul into an object in order to achieve immortality. But the restricted section didn't have all of the answers, which pushed young Riddle in the direction of Horace Slughorn, head of Slytherin House and one of Voldemort's confidants. With a little manipulation, Riddle ended up getting just the answers that he needed from Slughorn, completing his recipe for Horcruxes. From this point onward, Voldemort's soul began its downward journey. From the day that he created his first Horcrux, Voldemort began a cursed existence worthy only of a dark and evil wizard. But what Voldemort also unknowingly did in the process was seal his fate, giving him a false sense of security with regards to his alleged immortality. With all of the groundwork laid, let me dive into what Dumbledore's motivations may have been with regards to this troubled young boy. From the very beginning, Dumbledore knew that Voldemort would one day be trouble. As far as judges of character go, Dumbledore is one of the best, and who better to recognize an up-and-coming dark wizard than a former dark wizard? Dumbledore invited Tom Riddle to Hogwarts not to give him a wizarding education or set him on the right path, but instead to keep a watchful eye over him, ensuring that this evil young boy wasn't off somewhere else in the world doing whatever he pleased. And through observing Tom Riddle's actions over the years, his late nights in the restricted section, manipulating other students, etc., Dumbledore only became more and more sure of his initial assessment as time went on. Which is why just a few years after Tom Riddle had begun attending the school, Dumbledore placed a book about Horcruxes in the restricted section, and made it just obvious enough for young Tom Riddle to find. Tom Riddle wasn't secretive about wanting to become immortal, and he had discussed it with his gang on numerous occasions. What he didn't know, however, was that he was under Dumbledore's watchful eye. How could Dumbledore reasonably allow the heir of Slytherin to walk around the Hogwarts castle unsupervised? And because Dumbledore knew about Tom Riddle's obsession with becoming immortal, he decided that he would leverage this piece of information to his advantage. By planting the book on Horcruxes in the Hogwarts library, he intentionally placed Voldemort on his own path of destruction, knowing that a damaged soul and a false sense of security in his immortality through Horcruxes would only weaken Tom Riddle in the long run. We know that eventually Riddle seeks out Horace Slughorn to fill in the blanks on Horcruxes. What we never find out, however, is how on earth Horace Slughorn knew about Horcruxes himself. In the wizarding world, knowledge of supremely dark magic like that wasn't exactly common, which is why I think that Dumbledore, a former dark wizard himself, discussed it with Horace prior to Riddle's conversation with him. Well before planting the book for Riddle to find and gently pushing him in that direction, Dumbledore had a candid conversation with Slughorn about Horcruxes, where he attempted to educate this head of Slytherin House on the matter. By doing this, Dumbledore planted the seed of knowledge in Slughorn's mind, preparing him with answers for the day that young Tom Riddle came to him with questions. From the moment that young Riddle completed the puzzle that was Horcrux creation, he set off on his dark journey to split his soul and cement his immortality. In 1942, he created the Diary Horcrux. In 1943, he created the Ring Horcrux. In 1946, he created the Cup Horcrux. And sometime between 1946 and 1979, he also created both the Locket Horcrux and the Diadem Horcrux. In 1981, Voldemort inadvertently created his sixth Horcrux, Harry Potter, and in 1994, Voldemort created his final Horcrux, Nagini. Each and every time Voldemort created a new Horcrux, he gained new confidence in the fact that he was anchoring himself further and further to the mortal realm. From a young age, this boy wanted nothing more than to be tethered to life while he had the power to end the lives of others. But what he never knew was that the friendly old benevolent Dumbledore that visited him in his orphanage had been pulling on the strings the entire time. Dumbledore knew all along that by setting Voldemort on the path of Horcruxes, it would give him a false sense of security, rendering him easier to defeat in the long run. Voldemort placed massive value in his Horcruxes, but they came at the expense of his soul. Each and every time he created one, he became less human, and relied on those objects more and more for his own survival. Dumbledore knew what Voldemort was capable of all along, but he wasn't going to just kill a child in an orphanage. Instead, he let Voldemort's life play out, pulling at his strings along the way and having Voldemort create his own trump card for the day that he pushed things too far. In this way, Dumbledore was able to manipulate the most feared dark wizard to have ever lived. On numerous occasions, Dumbledore had said himself that he can't be trusted with power, and who better to assert his power over than a troubled dark wizard with little knowledge of the magical world. In the books and films, we're led to believe that Dumbledore was totally in the dark on Horcruxes. In fact, the earliest point at which we're led to believe Dumbledore became aware of Horcruxes was around the time of Harry's parents' deaths, as he told Snape that Voldemort would return. I think that Dumbledore knew about Horcruxes a lot earlier than that, and I think that he may have just played young Tom Riddle in the same way that he may or may not have played young Harry, raising him too like a pig for slaughter. Today, we'll be discussing the theory that Professor Albus Dumbledore, famed wizard and beloved headmaster of Hogwarts, was not actually a wizard at all, but death incarnate. If you're familiar with the final installment of the Harry Potter series, then you're likely well aware of the Deathly Hallows. After all, that final installment in both novel and film form is called the Deathly Hallows. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, here's a quick recap of what the infamous Deathly Hallows are, where they came from, and what they stand for. The Deathly Hallows are 3 fabled magical artifacts, all of which are featured in a rather popular children's book within the wizarding world called The Tales of Beedle the Bard. Included in a collection of similar stories, the fable is known as the Tale of the Three Brothers, in which there are 3 clever wizards, all of whom are, you guessed it, brothers. As the story goes, in attempting to cross a dangerous river, the men used their magic to make it safely to the other side. Death, who was used to claiming the lives of those who tried to cross this particular river, was furious that the 3 brothers had not perished in their crossing. In an effort to try and take their souls at a later date, Death appeared before the men and pretended to congratulate them, offering them gifts of their choosing, all of which had the capacity to hold incredible powers. The eldest brother, an arrogant, power-hungry wizard, asked for a wand stronger than any other. That very same day, after using what would become known in legend as the Elder Wand to duel and defeat another wizard, the eldest brother happily fell asleep, only to be murdered in the night, the wand stolen before dawn. The second brother, whose beloved had died not long before meeting Death, asked for an item that could bring people back from the dead. Death granted him a stone, the Resurrection Stone, that was able to do just that, and the brother used it to bring his former beloved back to the world of the living. What the middle brother hadn't anticipated was how miserable his former lover would be in a world that she no longer belonged to. She was cold and separated from him by a veil, and so, instead of continuing to suffer in this world without her in her material form, he took his own life and joined her in death. The youngest brother was a much humbler man than his older brothers, and did not seek an additional way to best Death. Instead, he asked for a way to hide from Death, so that he could live out the rest of his life peacefully. To fulfill this request, Death reluctantly gave the youngest brother the most powerful cloak of invisibility ever known to exist, one that even Death couldn't see through. And so, as the story goes, the 2 older brothers lost their lives to Death soon after crossing the river in which they had first bested him. But the youngest brother lived out a long and happy life, eventually taking the cloak off to greet Death as an old friend, and passing the invisibility cloak onto his son. Of course, this is just a fable, and I'm sure the author took liberties in the way in which he told the story. But there has been substantial proof to support that the tale of the three brothers was based on real wizards. In fact, Harry, Ron and Hermione themselves uncovered the long history of who the brothers may have been and whether or not the magical artifacts were real. During their hunt for Voldemort's Horcruxes in what would have been their final year at Hogwarts, the trio discovered that the Peveril brothers, Antioch, Cadmus and Ignotus, were likely the inspiration behind the tale. Not long after, they also discovered that one of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes was actually the Resurrection Stone. They even learned that Albus Dumbledore had knowingly been in possession of the Elder Wand for some time as well. Not to mention the fact that Harry came into possession of one of the Deathly Hallows himself at the mere age of 11, the Invisibility Cloak. This leads us to the question of, if the brothers were real, what about death? While it may seem rather unlikely that three wizards actually came up against death incarnate, stranger things have happened in the wizarding world of Harry Potter. So, who was Death? What did he look like? Where did he go? Is he still around toying with muggles and wizards alike? To me, these seem like reasonable questions, considering what we know so far. Yet, if you were to have asked wise old Professor Albus Dumbledore, as Harry did, he likely would have told you what he told Harry. I think it more likely that the Peveril brothers were simply gifted, dangerous wizards who succeeded in creating those powerful objects. In other words, according to Dumbledore, death was not a person, but simply a concept designed by the author of the tale of the three brothers to make an exciting narrative. But wouldn't that be a convenient thing to say for someone who perhaps knew more than they were letting on, and didn't want anyone to know the truth? For what if Professor Albus Dumbledore was Death? In many tales, Death with a capital D is not an actual human being, but a concept or force in the world that rules over and thrives on the death of people. In the tale of the three brothers, however, he is the personification of death. He is recognizable to the wizards as Death incarnate, and answers to the name by which he is known. So, wouldn't that mean that if Death took on a physical form, he would be recognizable as Death? I don't necessarily think so. What if over the centuries he chose to be a little more discreet? This would make sense, since when he met the Peveril brothers, it was the 13th century, and all things mystical and magic were a little more out in the open. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, the International Statute of Secrecy had been in effect for about 300 years. And if death was an actual presence in the world that can take on a physical form and communicate with the living, I would imagine that as time went on, he would have found that he needed to be a little more careful. I personally think that over the centuries, death would have met with mortals in many different forms. Of course, at first, he started off in his true material form as Death incarnate, as the Peveril brothers met him. But as time went on, and he had to be more discreet, he started to change his appearance in order to not become a target of both Muggle society and the wizarding world. In the late 1880s, what if he decided to wreak havoc by entering the world as a member of the Dumbledore family, assuming the form of one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore? As Albus, he was given the opportunity to toy with the imaginings of a young, power-hungry Gellert Grindelwald, fueling his ambitions for total control of the wizarding world and leading him to the idea of the three fabled gifts that he, as Death, had once bestowed upon the Peveril brothers. And if Grindelwald had been successful in his attempts to take over Muggles and magical society, imagine just how much death there would have been on Gellert's way to glory. As it were, there was already so much death at the hands of Grindelwald in his attempt to rise to power. What a victory for Death himself. And how could we forget how Dumbledore set up our boy, Harry, for sacrificial slaughter at the hands of Voldemort. For years, he helped mentor him in order to send him off to die at the hands of the darkest wizard the world had seen since Grindelwald. Isn't it interesting that Dumbledore seemed to be at the center of both Grindelwald and Voldemort's ascents to power? Not to mention that Albus Dumbledore was the one who gave Harry the invisibility cloak, just as he did with Ignotus Peveril centuries beforehand. Now, if you're thinking that this all seems a bit elaborate and twisted, consider the fact that death has been taking lives since the beginning of time. It stands to reason that over the millennia, he's gotten a bit bored. This is clearly showcased in his overly complex plan to take the lives of the Peveril brothers. Why would death trick them into thinking they had defeated him and to give them gifts that would be their eventual demise at least in the case of the two older brothers, if he very likely could have just killed them on the spot. I think he did this for the exact same reason that he decided to embody a wizard for over a century and to bring about death in extravagant and elaborate ways. He wanted a challenge. Another piece of evidence that supports this theory is the presence of 3 wizards in Dumbledore's life during the latter half of the 20th century that seem to mirror the 3 Peveril brothers. That is, wouldn't it make sense if death continuously recreated situations in which the players represented similar things to him, even if by accident? The similarities that I'm referencing here are between Lord Voldemort and the eldest Peveril brother, Antioch, Severus Snape and Cadmus Peveril, the middle brother, and Harry Potter and the youngest brother, Ignotus. A theory all unto its own, these similarities are actually quite striking, with the Dark Lord and Antioch both being obsessed by the idea of power and wanting to overcome death. It's also interesting to note that they both held the Elder Wand at some point within their lives. Snape and Cadmus, on the other hand, were both consumed by the loss of the woman they loved. For Snape, it was Lily Evans, Harry's mum, and for Cadmus, it was his deceased fiancée. In both instances, these 2 men allowed their emotions to dictate how they lived and died. Finally, there's Harry and Ignotus. This comparison is really quite simple, especially since Harry is presumably the ancestor of Ignotus Peveril, and they both owned the invisibility cloak and overcame the pursuit of death. Ignotus did so by using the cloak to hide from death, while Harry did so by offering himself up to die, only to survive the killing curse for the 2nd time in his life. Not to mention the fact that Dumbledore had a part in the deaths of both Voldemort and Snape, just as death did with Antioch and Cadmus. Today, we'll be discussing whether or not the late, great, and highly revered Albus Dumbledore ever created his own Horcrux before his untimely death. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the term or haven't read up on your Harry Potter lore recently, here's a quick review of Horcruxes, what exactly it takes to create one, and where they pop up in the Harry Potter series. To start with, what is a Horcrux and how is it made? Horcruxes are objects of dark magic that are created by a witch or wizard who wishes to live forever by immortalizing a piece of their soul inside a vessel of their choosing. The witch or wizard must first intentionally rip away a part of their soul from their body by committing murder in cold blood. Now, that last part, the bit about the murder being committed in cold blood, is particularly important for our topic today, but I'll explain that in just a moment. Once the soul has been split, the witch or wizard then magically places the piece of their torn soul into a vessel of their choosing in order to immortalize themselves. The vessel of a Horcrux can be just about anything, but it typically takes the form of an inanimate object. That said, it can be made by using a living being, such as an animal, creature, human, or otherwise. Making a living being into a Horcrux, however, comes with substantially more risk than using an inanimate object, as the vessel can obviously think for itself and may not obey the creator of the Horcrux, whose bit of soul lives inside them. For example, think of Harry Potter as Voldemort's Horcrux. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Finally, in order to complete the process of making a Horcrux, the witch or wizard must perform a ritual of dark magic that accompanies placing one's torn soul into the chosen vessel. What this ritual is exactly is not widely known, as the magic surrounding this type of dark magic is kept quite guarded by those who believe it to be among the most evil forms of magic in existence. For this reason, it is not taught in the curriculum at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and many students believe that not even the restricted section of the school's library contains any material on this particular dark topic. Which brings us to the series itself. When do Horcruxes appear in Harry Potter? Throughout Harry Potter, we primarily see Horcruxes used by Lord Voldemort in his attempt to immortalize himself and live forever. In fact, the Dark Lord is so desperate to live forever and remain the most powerful wizard in existence that he goes so far as to create 7 Horcruxes, a feat previously unheard of. The fact that that many Horcruxes had never been created by a single witch or wizard was due to the idea that ripping one's soul that many times would theoretically cause incredible instability, not only for the soul itself, but for the witch or wizard's remaining form, which we see with Voldemort's very non-human-like appearance. Not to mention the fact that the Dark Lord would have had to commit 7 murders in cold blood and perform the heinous ritual each and every time, a ritual too dark to be written about or taught at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. In any case, the first Horcrux of Voldemort's that we learn about is his former diary from when he was a student at Hogwarts. The next 3 Horcruxes are valuable possessions that belonged to 3 of the 4 Hogwarts founders, including Helga Hufflepuff's golden cup, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, and Salazar Slytherin's locket. Voldemort also managed to steal his uncle, Marvolo Gaunt's, heirloom ring, later to be discovered as the Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. The final Horcrux that the Dark Lord made intentionally was his snake companion, the Maledictus Nagini, with the 7th, truly final and inadvertent Horcrux being Harry Potter himself. This, of course, brings us to today's theory in question. Did Albus Dumbledore ever create his own Horcrux? Let's take a look. Dumbledore's Horcrux, the theory. So, knowing that creating a Horcrux is a bit of extremely dark magic that we've previously only heard about Lord Voldemort practicing, and I suppose Herpo the Foul, how did a theory surrounding the incredibly well-respected Albus Dumbledore and Horcruxes even come to be? Well, apparently the theory, which has been around for years, is the result of multiple fan theories. The 2 most prominent both claim that it's possible that Dumbledore could have created his own Horcrux in his youth. However, they differ in terms of which vessel they believe he used to deposit his soul into. One of the very first theories claimed that Dumbledore could have created a Horcrux out of the Elder Wand, another one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, while the other, more prominent theory said that his Horcrux may actually have been Fawkes, Dumbledore's pet phoenix. These theories were further supported by fans' unified belief that Dumbledore has a, for want of a better word, darker side. This clearly stems from the fact that he had an intense friendship with Gellert Grindelwald and held incredibly misguided ideological beliefs in his youth. Not to mention the whole "he raised up Harry like a pig for slaughter" thing. And while I'll admit that Dumbledore is not all butterflies and sherbet lemons, I really can't believe that Albus Dumbledore was capable of such a thing. Dumbledore's Horcrux debunked. In my opinion, the theory that Dumbledore secretly made a Horcrux just doesn't make any sense. For one thing, he's never murdered anyone in cold blood. While I guess it's possible that he secretly killed another witch or wizard this way, it seems rather unlikely considering all the things that he eventually stood for and opposed, such as Grindelwald and Voldemort. Meaning the only instance that we know of in which Albus was involved in someone's death was his sister, Ariana Dumbledore's. Ariana's accidental death occurred around the year 1900, soon after Albus had graduated from his final year at Hogwarts. The issue here is that no one, not even Dumbledore himself, knew who dealt the magical blow that killed Ariana. In fact, she may have actually killed herself, as she was an Obscurial whose magic was incredibly unpredictable and dangerous. Even so, if Dumbledore was responsible for casting the magic that killed Ariana, it certainly wasn't done in cold blood. In fact, Ariana's death was an accident that he lamented until he himself died, feeling incredible guilt and remorse for not better protecting his ailing younger sister. Not to mention the fact that he never performed the dark magic ritual associated with creating a Horcrux. Personally, I don't care how devastated he was about the death of his sister. There's no way his feelings of remorse and guilt could have clouded his judgment to the point that he would have mutilated or disrespected her body to create a Horcrux. Then there's the question of the actual objects suspected of being Albus Dumbledore's Horcruxes, the Elder Wand and Fawkes the Phoenix. At this point in his life, during the height of his relationship with Grindelwald and his belief that the 2 of them needed to reunite the 3 Deathly Hallows and overtake the Muggle race, there's no way he even had the Elder Wand. At this time, Dumbledore also had yet to meet Fawkes, as it's widely believed that the first time he encountered the bird was in the late 1920s when a phoenix, presumed to be Fawkes, came to the aid of Credence, who was actually Albus's nephew, Aurelius Dumbledore. It's speculated that Fawkes then became Dumbledore's companion after these events. There's also the fact that Fawkes' behavior towards Dumbledore, while certainly similar to the loyalty of, say, Nagini to Voldemort, or Horcrux to Wizard, if you will, is completely different in a many number of ways. To start with, the Dumbledore family and Phoenixes have a long-standing history and relationship in which the rare and powerful birds are known to come to the aid of any Dumbledore in need. Albus mentions that his grandfather benefited from such a bond, and we also see this occur when the Phoenix comes to Credence's side in Fantastic Beasts 2, and then again in 3. There's also the fact that after Albus Dumbledore's death, Fawkes sings his lament and then leaves, never to be seen again. If he had part of Dumbledore inside him, you'd think he would have stuck around to help Harry defeat Voldemort, right? My final note on why this theory is not valid is the sheer fact that it's been rejected by J.K. Rowling, who came right out and called it strangely unsettling. Today, we're going to be discussing Dumbledore, the Potters, and the fabled invisibility cloak. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the events of the time period surrounding the Potters' murder, and why on earth Dumbledore chose to borrow an item of such great protection when the Potter family's lives were in imminent danger. If the cloak is so powerful that even death can't find you, wouldn't it be most useful in the hands of people who are hiding from the most powerful dark wizard to have ever lived? Let's dive in. The invisibility cloak is a powerful magical artifact that once belonged to Ignotus Peverell, the youngest brother from the Tale of Three Brothers, a story outlining the origin of each Deathly Hallow. The plot surrounds the three wizard brothers and their ability to cheat death for a short period of time. After conquering death, a personification of death, under the guise of congratulating them, awards them with three gifts: the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Invisibility Cloak. Long story short, each brother chose one of the gifts that death had presented them. Ignotus, the youngest, chose the Invisibility Cloak. All three of these objects are massively instrumental in the Harry Potter story, and while the Elder Wand is a huge plot driver, the Invisibility Cloak definitely ended up being the most useful Hallow for Harry, which is interesting because it was indirectly handed down to him by his father. After James's death, it was kept safe until Harry was old enough to appreciate it, at which point Dumbledore anonymously gifted the cloak to Harry in the Philosopher's Stone. But why did Dumbledore have this Potter family artifact? Around the time that Lord Voldemort was hunting the Potters, the Cloak of Invisibility came to the attention of Dumbledore when James showed it to him. And after a cursory inspection of the cloak, Dumbledore ended up asking to borrow the cloak from James in order to study it. But this was a bit of a weird request. Dumbledore had the power to cast the Disillusionment Charm, a spell capable of rendering him invisible, allowing him to perfectly blend in with his surroundings. What use could he have possibly had with the invisibility cloak? And of all of the times to borrow it, this seems like the most inappropriate. The most obvious and safe answer is that Dumbledore wanted to study the cloak because it's one of the three Deathly Hallows. In his youth, Dumbledore became infatuated with the idea of uniting the three Hallows, and though he had long since abandoned that path, he maintained an interest in these powerful magical artifacts. Being a highly knowledgeable and curious wizard, it's possible that he may have wanted to explore the cloak's capabilities and better understand its origins. Furthermore, it's likely that Dumbledore did not feel that James Potter needed the invisibility cloak for protection against Lord Voldemort, as the family was already safeguarded by the Fidelius Charm, a powerful enchantment that concealed the location of the Potter family from Voldemort. But of course we all know how well the Fidelius Charm worked out for them. After being betrayed by their secret keeper, Peter Pettigrew, all of the Potters but Harry were killed after Voldemort entered their cottage in Godric's Hollow. With James killed, the cloak was left in Dumbledore's possession. He later explains the origins of the cloak to Harry. The cloak, as you know now, travelled down through the ages, father to son, mother to daughter, right down to Ignotus's last living descendant, who was born, as Ignotus was, in the village of Godric's Hollow. Dumbledore smiled at Harry. Me? You have guessed. I know why the cloak was in my possession on the night your parents died. James had showed it to me just a few days previously. But there's something that feels off about all of this. The Potters were in immense danger. They had the most dangerous dark wizard of all time specifically targeting them, and they went to extreme measures to stay hidden, enlisting the help of the Fidelius Charm. How could Dumbledore have had such a major oversight in borrowing the cloak from James? How could he have been so obtuse? Dumbledore is a calculated, powerful, wise old wizard that's typically steps ahead of everyone. Something doesn't sit right with me here. Hold on to your broomsticks, because I've got a scandalous theory. I think that Dumbledore may have deliberately borrowed the cloak with the intention of leaving the Potter family more vulnerable to Lord Voldemort. Hear me out. I think that Dumbledore's actions in this scenario spell out a strategic and calculated decision, rather than mere curiosity. I think that Dumbledore, who had deep knowledge of the prophecy regarding Harry Potter and Voldemort, recognized the potential significance of the cloak in the upcoming conflict. By borrowing the cloak, it's possible that he sought to manipulate the course of events to align with his vision of defeating Voldemort. And one possible motivation behind this theory is Dumbledore's belief in the concept of the greater good. Dumbledore was aware of this prophecy and its importance, as well as the fact that Voldemort was seeking to destroy the Potter family in order to eliminate the one who could defeat him. It's possible that Dumbledore saw borrowing the invisibility cloak as a calculated move in fulfilling the prophecy and ultimately defeating Voldemort. He may have reasoned that sacrificing the immediate protection offered by the invisibility cloak would ultimately lead to a more advantageous outcome, such as enabling Harry to fulfill his role in the prophecy and ultimately defeat Voldemort. This theory also challenges the notion that Dumbledore saw no need for the invisibility cloak due to the Fidelius charm. Instead, it suggests that he intentionally gambled with the safety of the Potter family, placing greater importance on the overall outcome of the battle against Voldemort. Dumbledore's manipulation of events throughout the series suggests time and time again that he was willing to take risks for the sake of the greater good. He orchestrated the events leading up to the Battle of Hogwarts, even knowingly placing Harry in harm's way to ultimately defeat Voldemort. Borrowing the invisibility cloak would not be out of character for Dumbledore, as it aligned with his willingness to make difficult decisions and sacrifices in service of the larger goal. But I know that there are some fans out there who can't possibly rationalize or come to terms with the idea that Dumbledore may be evil, so I'll also introduce some counterpoints to this theory. The main counter-argument is just what the story tells us, that Dumbledore made the decision to borrow the invisibility cloak out of pure curiosity. I mentioned earlier that there's no way Dumbledore could have been so obtuse as to borrow the cloak without consideration for the repercussions of his actions, but there may be a hole in that assertion. You see, when it comes to the Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore can be a bit of a blustering buffoon. Ever since his youth, Dumbledore had a long-standing and dangerous obsession with the three magical artifacts, and it's entirely possible that the dangling carrot that was the opportunity to inspect the invisibility cloak may have caused him to act out of character. Dumbledore's dangerous obsession with the three Deathly Hallows can be attributed to several factors, including his thirst for knowledge, his desire for power, and his fascination with the mysteries of life and death. Firstly, Dumbledore was known for his insatiable thirst for knowledge and understanding. He was a highly intelligent wizard who delved deep into the realms of magic, history, and ancient artifacts. The Deathly Hallows, with their immense power and significance, would undoubtedly have piqued Dumbledore's intellectual curiosity. He would have been drawn to their legends and the potential understanding they could provide about the nature of magic itself. Secondly, Dumbledore's desire for power cannot be overlooked. While he was primarily driven by a desire to protect and bring about good, there were instances where his hunger for power and influence was revealed. The Deathly Hallows, especially the Elder Wand, represented the ultimate power in the wizarding world. Possessing all three Hallows would have granted Dumbledore an unprecedented level of control and authority, which may have enticed him. Dumbledore has a good line on this. It is a curious thing, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. Furthermore, Dumbledore had a deep fascination with life and death and sought to unlock their mysteries. The Deathly Hallows symbolized the mastery over death, and Dumbledore's exploration of this theme was evident in his research and encounters with various magical artifacts throughout his life. The Hallows represented a way for Dumbledore to understand and potentially even conquer death, which may have fueled his obsession. While Dumbledore ultimately used his knowledge and power for the greater good, his dangerous obsession with the Deathly Hallows hints at the potential for him to become consumed by ambition and to lose sight of his noble intentions. It's also possible that his fascination with these objects clouded his judgment, causing him to overlook things like the Potters potentially needing the cloak to protect themselves. A good example of Dumbledore's clouded judgment can be accurately exemplified by his interaction with Marvolo Gaunt's ring. Dumbledore put on the Horcrux ring, also known as Marvolo Gaunt's ring, because he believed it contained the Resurrection Stone, one of the three Deathly Hallows. He wanted to use the stone to communicate with and possibly see his deceased loved ones. However, Dumbledore was aware that the ring was also a Horcrux, carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, and would be cursed. He was willing to risk putting on the ring despite the potential danger because of his overwhelming desire to reunite with his deceased family and find solace in their presence. Thus, his decision to put on the ring was driven by a mix of curiosity, his thirst for knowledge, and his longing for his lost loved ones. Despite his good intentions, the choice ultimately had dire consequences. Today, we're going to be discussing Voldemort, Dumbledore, and one rather large question that I'm sure has crossed the minds of every Harry Potter fan at one point or another. Why didn't Dumbledore just hunt Voldemort down? I know, it's not that simple. Logistically, the subject is precarious to say the least. But just for a moment, let's pretend that Dumbledore decided to set off in search of Voldemort and simply killed the tyrannical Dark Wizard, effectively stopping him in his tracks. And if not kill him, couldn't he have imprisoned him in the same way that he imprisoned Grindelwald? In the event of either of these situations, what would have happened next? Would this have been any kind of a permanent solution? And of course the big one, is this situation even a feasible one? Join me as we unpack the question of why on earth Dumbledore failed to defeat Voldemort all by himself, instead relying on the fabled boy who lived. Let's dive in. The first thing that I want to reinforce is that Dumbledore was, unquestionably, one of the most powerful wizards in the Harry Potter universe. From an extremely young age, Dumbledore's magical abilities consistently turned heads, particularly his skill surrounding charms and transfiguration. He also did exceptionally well on his newts, and Griselda Marchbanks, a professor working for the Wizarding Examinations Authority, remarked that Albus was able to do things with a wand that she had never seen before. In his youth, Dumbledore also spent much of his time with Gellert Grindelwald, another one of the Wizarding world's most powerful wizards. By association, it's likely that the two boys' skill sets merged to some extent, resulting in each wizard achieving a greater level of power than what would have been independently possible. As Dumbledore grew older, he left no stone unturned when it came to magical abilities, becoming a master of transfiguration, charms, potions, elemental magic, occlumency, and more. Dumbledore is truly the exception to the phrase "Jack of all trades, master of none," as he was a master of all. So if Dumbledore was so powerful, what was stopping him from tracking Voldemort down and overpowering him, putting an end to the Dark Lord's reign? Well, there are a number of reasons. The first reason is that Dumbledore, though exceedingly powerful, was equally as modest. This is exemplified in the following conversation between him and McGonagall. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one, Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers I will never have." To which McGonagall replies, "Only because you're too, noble to use them." Though Dumbledore possessed power that was potentially unmatched by every other wizard, he believed that Voldemort had achieved a level of power akin to his own. With the belief that Voldemort was just as strong, if not stronger than him, why would the wise tactician that is Dumbledore embark on such a risky mission? Furthermore, Dumbledore knew all about Voldemort's Horcruxes, horrific dark relics that tied Voldemort to the mortal realm. So long as Voldemort possessed all of his Horcruxes, Voldemort would be able to return back to the land of the living over and over. Dumbledore, on the other hand, did not have this luxury. While Dumbledore was incredibly powerful, he was also very much mortal, as shown during the events atop the Astronomy Tower in The Half-Blood Prince. Even if Dumbledore was entirely confident that he was 10, 20, even 30% stronger than Voldemort, there was still a chance that he could be defeated by Voldemort, and if he lost, then it would be game over. Sure, with the knowledge of Voldemort's Horcruxes, Dumbledore may have just tried to overpower and imprison Voldemort, but I imagine that task would have been even more difficult. Even with an existing power gap, Voldemort would not have been easily subdued with power and power alone. This brings me to my next point. Instead of actively pursuing Voldemort, Dumbledore instead made it his mission to look after others and ensure that those under his care were well protected. Dumbledore recognized the importance of preserving the Wizarding world's cultural heritage, and he took his role as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry very seriously. As headmaster, he was responsible for preserving the school's traditions and ensuring that future generations of wizards would be able to learn and grow in a safe and supportive environment. Had Dumbledore gone off on some dangerous mission and fallen at the hands of Voldemort, the wizarding world would have been that much more open to attacks. Voldemort was a powerful and ruthless wizard that feared no one, except for Dumbledore. As long as Dumbledore was around, Voldemort would be forced to lurk in the shadows, at least somewhat, and slowly rebuild. Without Dumbledore, Voldemort would have been able to launch an attack on the wizarding world much sooner. There are several instances in the series where Voldemort expresses fear or concern about Dumbledore. For example, in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort is shown to be worried about the fact that Dumbledore has been studying him and gathering information about his past. Voldemort is also known to have avoided direct confrontation with Dumbledore whenever possible. Overall, while Voldemort was a powerful and intimidating wizard, he did fear Dumbledore's strength and intelligence, and recognized him as a formidable opponent. Regardless of how Voldemort sought to portray himself, a fearless, bloodthirsty warlord, most witches and wizards knew that deep down he feared Dumbledore, and Voldemort knew that Dumbledore had more than enough talent to defeat him. In order to protect his students and preserve other aspects of the wizarding world, Dumbledore decided not to try and hunt down Voldemort himself. Instead, he focused his efforts on teaching, protecting, and empowering others. The next reason that Dumbledore avoided confronting Voldemort was the fabled prophecy, which foretold the birth of a child with the power to vanquish Voldemort. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The prophecy essentially predicted that Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort were destined to face each other in a final confrontation, with one ultimately defeating the other. Dumbledore believed that this prophecy referred to young Harry, and that it was Harry's destiny to defeat Voldemort and not his own. For this reason, he chose to support Harry and give him aid where possible rather than face Voldemort himself. What good could come from facing Voldemort if he wasn't the one destined to defeat him? The final reason that Dumbledore may have avoided hunting Voldemort comes down to his character. For most of his youth, Dumbledore was a man of dubious morality, often making the wrong choices in the pursuit of power. However, following the death of his sister and his parting of ways from Grindelwald, Dumbledore no longer glorified power in the way that he once did. The immense trauma that he had endured forced Dumbledore to sit down and reevaluate what was important to him. In this period of reevaluation, he realized that it was no longer his ambition to seek power or assert dominance over others. Hunting down Voldemort and having the Dark Lord grovel at his feet for freedom would have been against the new way of life that he had paved for himself. Dumbledore's sheer desire to avoid any form of power is well demonstrated in the following passage. Years passed, there were rumors about him. They said he had procured a wand of immense power. I, meanwhile, was offered the post of Minister of Magic, not once, but several times. Naturally, I refused. I had learned that I was not to be trusted with power. But you'd have been better, much better than Fudge or Scrimgeour, burst out Harry. Would I? Asked Dumbledore heavily. I'm not so sure. I had proven, as a very young man, that power was my weakness and my temptation. It is a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. Those who, like you, have leadership thrust upon them, and take up the mantle because they must, and find to their own surprise that they wear it well. I was safer at Hogwarts. I think I was a good teacher. Today I've got a theory for you which exposes Dumbledore's true motivations for the school's Defense Against the Dark Arts posting. Severus Snape became the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor during Harry's 6th year at Hogwarts, and in theory he was perfect for the position. He had a profound understanding of both sides of the magical spectrum and knew more about the dark arts than most, making him the perfect candidate to teach students all about it. So why didn't he assume the role sooner? If Snape was so perfect for it, why couldn't he just have the job? Why did he have to wait until Harry was in his 6th year? Why did we have to first go through Quirrell, Lockhart, Lupin, Fake Moody and Umbridge before Snape got his chance? The answer may be more complicated than you think. But before we dive into this theory any further, I need to provide a little bit of a backstory on the position. Defense Against the Dark Arts is a core subject taught at Hogwarts that teaches students how to defend themselves against dark magic, creatures and curses. Though historically, I'm not convinced this subject has been particularly successful in this regard. The curriculum covers a wide range of topics, including recognizing and repelling dark creatures, identifying and countering curses, and learning protective spells. But for as long as Harry attended Hogwarts, and actually for many decades prior, the subject had a ludicrously high turnover rate. Every single year that Harry attended Hogwarts, he had a completely different professor that taught the subject in an entirely different way. And who was responsible for this? Why, Lord Voldemort, of course. This is explained to Harry by Dumbledore. "Oh, he definitely wanted the Defense Against the Dark Arts job," said Dumbledore. "The aftermath of our little meeting proved that. You see, we have never been able to keep a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher for longer than a year since I refused the post to Lord Voldemort. And it all dates back to young Tom Riddle's graduation from Hogwarts. Shortly after completing his studies, Tom Riddle expressed his desire to become the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at his alma mater, partially driven by his love for the school and partially driven by his fascination with the dark arts. And he didn't waste any time, quickly submitting an application to then Headmaster Armando Dippet. After some time, Dippet ended up refusing Riddle's application, citing his age, but did encourage him to reapply in the future if he was still interested. More than 2 decades later, Riddle emerged as the enigmatic and notorious Lord Voldemort. Seeking an opportunity to return to Hogwarts, Voldemort once again pursued the coveted Defense Against the Dark Arts position. However, this time, Albus Dumbledore had assumed the role of headmaster. Recognizing Voldemort's dark intentions, Dumbledore staunchly rejected his application. Despite Voldemort's ulterior motives of using the application as a pretext to conduct research on dark magic, recruit followers, and conceal one of his Horcruxes, he was enraged by the denial of his return to the school. After his denial, Voldemort sought vengeance by jinxing the position, ensuring that from that point onward, no one could maintain the Defense Against the Dark Arts post for more than 1 year. And as far as conventional understanding of the Harry Potter story goes, everyone has always accepted this fact at face value. No one can hold the position for more than a year, and that's about all there is to it. There's no explanation for why 1 year or how 1 year is actually enforced. So the position was cursed, with no professor able to maintain the role for more than 1 year. Conventional understanding would suggest that it was Snape's dark past that impacted his ability to assume the role of Data Professor. Even Snape himself assumed this. "Not quite," said Snape calmly. "He wouldn't give me the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, you know. Seemed to think it might, bring about a relapse, tempt me into my old ways." Having been a former Death Eater, Snape's past involvement with the dark side of magic is well known. The role of the Data Professor requires a teacher who possesses deep knowledge of both defensive and offensive magic. It's reasonable to assume that such an appointment could bear the potential to reignite Snape's darker tendencies. Therefore, many individuals, including Snape himself, may have assumed that the decision to pass over Snape for the Data Professor role, despite his expertise and skills, may have been a cautious measure to prevent any potential regression or risk associated with his past involvement in the dark arts. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Here's what I think. Dumbledore didn't give Snape the Defense Against the Dark Arts job because he suspected the post was cursed and simply didn't want to lose Snape from Hogwarts. Going by his suspicions, Dumbledore would have lost Snape in just 1 school year, and he knew that he would need Snape by his side for his future plans. Despite not being able to prove it entirely, Dumbledore had long suspected that Riddle had cursed the job and that anyone who assumed the post for more than a year would somehow invariably depart from Hogwarts in any number of ways. 1 sacked, 1 dead, 1's memory erased, and 1 locked in a trunk for 9 months, said Harry, counting them off on his fingers. Dumbledore understood that if he gave Snape the Defense Against the Dark Arts position, he would lose him from Hogwarts within a year. And the truth was that Snape was simply too valuable as an ally and informant to risk losing him in such a manner. However, in Harry's 6th year, when Dumbledore learned of his impending death, he finally allowed Snape to take on the coveted post, only doing so because he knew that time was limited and that by the end of the year that Snape would be exposed as a Death Eater, having murdered Dumbledore and no longer able to remain as a teacher at Hogwarts. After years of turning him down, Dumbledore only grants Snape his desired position due to the looming end of their journey. In some ways, it may have also been a form of compensation to Snape for his ultimate sacrifice in ending Dumbledore's life before Voldemort or Fenrir could do so. "You refuse to tell me everything, yet you expect that small service of me," snarled Snape, and real anger flared in the thin face now. "You take a great deal for granted, Dumbledore. Perhaps I have changed my mind." Had Snape been given the role of Dana Professor much sooner, there are so many things that he wouldn't have been able to accomplish, the most important of which was protecting Harry Potter. For starters, his absence would have meant, to some degree, that he wouldn't have been able to work quite as effectively in his role as a double agent throughout the series. Throughout the books, Snape provides valuable intelligence to the Order of the Phoenix while infiltrating Voldemort's inner circle as a loyal Death Eater. This allowed him to relay crucial information about Voldemort's plans, strategies, and weaknesses to the Order, aiding in their efforts to thwart the Dark Lord. There's also no way of predicting how Snape would have been removed from the position. Something awful could have happened to him. Quirrell died, Lockhart completely lost his marbles, Lupin was banished, Barty Crouch Jr. was exposed and subjected to the Dementor's kiss, and Umbridge was carried off into the forest by a bunch of centaurs. Had Snape assumed the role sooner, he very well may have faced his own unfortunate exit from the role. But perhaps the most important role that Snape wouldn't have been able to fulfill is that of Harry's protector. Despite his complex relationship with Harry, Snape's primary objective was to protect him, an act of penance for betraying the Potters all those years prior. Throughout the book, Snape took significant risks to ensure Harry's safety, even at times when it seemed he was acting against him. Had Snape not been there to intervene in situations where Harry's life was in danger, the books might have gone a very different direction. And inevitably, not even Snape, who'd vied for the Dana teaching position for so many years, ended up being exempt from Voldemort's wicked curse. The same school year forced Snape to begin taking action with regards to his perceived allegiances. And by the end of the school year, Snape was forced to choose his side, ruining his reputation with those he respected, even if it was all just for the optics. But at the end of the day, Snape's deepest fear was that he would fail to fulfill his promise to protect Lily's son, Harry, due to his own past mistakes. But had he been given the role of Dana Professor sooner, and inevitably ousted from the school, he certainly wouldn't have been able to accomplish this goal. So it's a good thing that Dumbledore paid heed to Voldemort's curse. Today we're going to be discussing Albus Dumbledore and a theory about how he always seemed to maintain some level of control. First things first, Dumbledore is unquestionably one of the most powerful and intelligent wizards to have ever lived. While at school, Dumbledore's magical abilities consistently turned heads, particularly his skills surrounding charms and transfiguration. He also did exceptionally well on his newts and owls. Griselda Marchbanks, a professor working for the Wizarding Examinations Authority, remarked that Albus was able to do things with a wand that she had never seen before. Remember that. He was remarkably wise, cunning, tactical, and even emotionally intelligent. But while Dumbledore may very well be all of these things, the series often portrayed him to be practically omniscient, so much so that it's even remarked upon by other characters. "You are omniscient as ever, Dumbledore." "Oh no, merely friendly with the local barman." And while this may have been a somewhat playful comment on Dumbledore's behalf, I think that there may actually be some pointers in the story that help to explain Dumbledore's seemingly all-knowing perspective. Dumbledore, throughout the books, just seems to give off an overwhelming feeling that he knows what's going around him at all times. And as it turns out, there may be a practical explanation for this. Enter Chocolate Frog cards. Chocolate Frog cards were magical trading cards that displayed pictures of famous figures in the wizarding world, and included a little bit of information about them. They could be obtained by purchasing chocolate frogs, which contained a random card inside. The famous cards are first discussed by Ron Weasley on the Hogwarts Express in The Philosopher's Stone. Chocolate frogs have cards inside them, to collect. Famous witches and wizards. I've got about 500. but I haven't got Agrippa or Ptolemy. As for the history of the cards, we don't actually know when they were introduced. However, we do know that they underwent a packaging change in 1926. The theory is this: Dumbledore utilized his portraits on the Chocolate Frog cards to spy on people, creating the perfect network for espionage. These collectible cards were extremely popular in the wizarding world, and since Dumbledore's card was quite common, it could have served as a potential source of communication. Just as Dumbledore made use of the headmaster portraits in his office at Hogwarts to send messages and observe other locations, it is plausible that he could have employed a similar tactic with his Chocolate Frog equivalent. This would of course require some magical tampering, but given Dumbledore's ingenuity, it is reasonable to assume that he would have been capable of such manipulation. And who pops up on a Chocolate Frog card as early as Harry's very first encounter with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger aboard the Hogwarts Express? Why, Albus Dumbledore, of course. Harry is introduced to Dumbledore somewhat through the Chocolate Frog card he opens on the train to Hogwarts. But Harry can't quite comprehend why Dumbledore's picture keeps disappearing. To this, Ron explains to Harry that Dumbledore can't be there all the time, and while this comes across as a fairly innocuous, potentially playful comment, maybe he really can't be there all the time, the reason being that he's gone off to spy on someone else. Furthermore, Dumbledore demonstrates other spying techniques in the series, like in the Order of the Phoenix, when he employed the portraits of past Hogwarts headmasters and headmistresses to gather information on the Department of Mysteries. If the Chocolate Frog cards could indeed be used similarly to the portraits in the Hogwarts headmaster's office, they could serve as an extensive network of spies for Dumbledore throughout the wizarding world. Since most individuals in possession of a Chocolate Frog card would be unsuspecting witches and wizards, it would provide Dumbledore with a means to observe their surroundings and to gain valuable insights. Alright, so that's the theory. Now let's take a look at a few arguments for and against. Titles. In the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore was stripped of many honors the wizarding world had bestowed on him, and one of the first things he was informed of was that he had been removed from the Wizengamot. Upon hearing this news, Dumbledore didn't really seem to care, but one thing he did mention is that he did not want to be removed from the Chocolate Frog cards. This remark, at face value, seems typical of Dumbledore's humorous nature, but in the face of this theory may now hold deeper meaning. During this period in time, Dumbledore's influence in the wizarding world was waning, and he may have seen his Chocolate Frog cards as a way of staying connected to current events. For example, imagine if the Minister for Magic kept one of his cards hidden in his desk. Via this card, Dumbledore could have received valuable information on how the government was handling, or not handling, the return of the Dark Lord. Thus, it would make sense that losing his position on the Chocolate Frog cards would be the accolade Dumbledore would want to preserve above all else. They're trying to discredit him. Didn't you see the Daily Prophet last week? They reported that he'd been voted out of the chairmanship of the International Confederation of Wizards because he's getting old and losing his grip. But it's not true. He was voted out by Ministry Wizards after he made a speech announcing Voldemort's return. They've demoted him from Chief Warlock on the Wizengamot. That's the Wizard High Court. And they're talking about taking away his Order of Merlin First Class, too. But Dumbledore says he doesn't care what they do as long as they don't take him off the Chocolate Frog cards. Ron's response. Next, I want to go all the way back to the Philosopher's Stone and Harry's first encounter with Dumbledore's card. The logistics of how Dumbledore would utilize Chocolate Frog cards are rather intricate. The theory suggests that the images on these cards have the ability to move between the various collectibles scattered throughout the wizarding world. Ron's remark to Harry on the Hogwarts Express seems to support this notion. When Dumbledore's image vanished from Harry's card, Ron commented, "Well, you can't expect him to hang around all day, can you?" This implies that there might only be a single, or perhaps a few, miniature Dumbledore figures that can jump from card to card. Furthermore, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it's revealed that individuals depicted in portraits have the ability to move to other portraits of themselves, regardless of the distance between them. This explains why Harry, Ron, and Hermione took Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait from Grimmauld Place. If such inter-portrait travel was feasible, and if Chocolate Frog cards operated under the same principle, then this theory regarding Harry Potter could indeed be quite plausible. Issues. Alright, so hopefully I've been able to convince you of this theory thus far. Here come some of the holes. First of all, this theory only works on the basis that Chocolate Frog cards work just like magical portraits. I actually happen to have made a video on magical portraits, and during that process I discovered just how intricate these portraits are, particularly Headmaster's portraits. Dumbledore was a particularly gifted wizard, but in some ways the magic required for a secret informant network of chocolate frog cards seems out of reach. Next, we have the ethical considerations. There are plenty of theories out there suggesting that Dumbledore was of dubious morality, and the plausibility of this theory may very well depend on your own perspective of Dumbledore. If you subscribe to the idea that Dumbledore was a puppet master who manipulated people, this theory might just work for you. But if you subscribe more to the belief that Dumbledore was very much a reformed and benevolent man, then it may not tick as many boxes. Having a network of chocolate frog card informants would be extremely unethical and a massive breach of privacy to, well, anyone that had a card. Then again, the argument could also be made by Dumbledore that it was all for the greater good. Today, we're going to be discussing how Hogwarts Legacy may have just given us an entirely new perspective on the death of beloved Hogwarts Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. Hogwarts Legacy takes place in the late 1800s, supposedly 1890, which means that during the course of the game, Dumbledore is just a mere 9 years old. However, the thing that Hogwarts Legacy exposes has nothing to do with Dumbledore in that timeline, but rather it emphasizes an aspect of the lore that impacts Dumbledore many years later. The wizarding world in the 1800s was still the wizarding world, and the rules of this world are very much the same as the rules in the Harry Potter time period. First, we'll discuss his death, then we'll segue into how Hogwarts Legacy changes it. In Chapter 27 of The Half-Blood Prince, the chapter dramatically named The Lightning-Struck Tower, Dumbledore meets his demise at the hands of Severus Snape. "Severus, please." Snape raised his wand and pointed it directly at Dumbledore. Avada Kedavra! A jet of green light shot from the end of Snape's wand and hit Dumbledore squarely in the chest. Harry's scream of horror never left him, silent and unmoving. He was forced to watch as Dumbledore was blasted into the air. For a split second, he seemed to hang suspended beneath the shining skull, and then he fell slowly backwards, like a great rag doll, over the battlements and out of sight. The passage above references Dumbledore's death at the hands of Severus Snape on the 30th of June, 1997, a pivotal moment in the series that shocked the wizarding world to its core. Dumbledore's death was a big deal. He was 115 years old and had made a profound impact on the wizarding world over the course of his life. His death also raised a lot of questions. How could the wise and powerful Dumbledore be defeated in such a paltry manner? The first thing we need to dig into deeper is how he died, as this bears immense significance with regards to how Hogwarts Legacy may have impacted it. Typically, it's inferred that Snape's killing curse, Avada Kedavra, was more than enough to finish him off, but one overlooked component is his fall. After being struck by Snape's curse, Dumbledore fell over the battlements and out of sight, but one detail of significance is that his origin was the Astronomy Tower, the tallest tower at Hogwarts Castle. Since Hogwarts Legacy came out, players all over the world have been trying their best to connect the dots between the in-game canon and the existing series, and one such activity that has become particularly popular is visiting the place where Dumbledore met his demise. Atop the Astronomy Tower, hope was at one time entirely lost for the wizarding world, but in the 1800s, I doubt this tower possessed such an ominous connection. Players all over Reddit have chimed in on this matter, and they also seem to have noticed an issue with the spot where Dumbledore fell. One Reddit user tipped off players, "You can go visit the spot where Dumbledore fell off the tower, except that there's no way to fall on the ground from there." So, they continued to explain, "We can only assume that canonically, this is what happened." The Redditor then included a diagram of the Hogwarts Tower with an illustration showing the most likely route of the late Headmaster's fall. And let's just say, Dumbledore's fall would not have been pleasant, a far from linear drop that would have had Dumbledore bouncing around like a rag doll. However, others were quick to chime in with their own feedback, offering counter-arguments for why this illustration of Hogwarts may not be entirely accurate, at least at the time of his death. "It's already been established that Hogwarts has an ever-changing floor pattern," commented one Reddit user. "There's a throwaway line in the game that the castle changes periodically. And while this is true, I'm not entirely convinced that the exterior of the castle would have changed in such dramatic fashion." Others added that perhaps the weather would have played a role in influencing Dumbledore's fall. Maybe it was a windy night. Bodies don't drop straight down, especially if there was wind. Others, however, had a different reaction. Man, that old man was bouncy. Whichever way you look at it, Dumbledore's fall would not have been pleasant. Even if he did fall straight down, and even if he had been killed by the killing curse prior to falling, it's not exactly a graceful way to go. But here's where I've got a glimpse of hope for some of you, at least the ones that are open to theories. I don't think that Dumbledore died from Snape's curse. I think that the only way he could have died was if he had succumbed to the fall. The reason that I say this is that the curse used to kill Dumbledore was none other than Avada Kedavra, which, as we know, requires great intent in order to be used successfully. Even though it was part of their plan, I'm not entirely convinced that Snape would have been able to muster the true intent in order to effectively strike down the headmaster. But this still leaves us with Dumbledore being blown off the side of Hogwarts, a fate which, entirely by itself, would have been enough to bring the headmaster to his demise. There are actually quite a few ways that he could have A. survived the fall, and B. faked his death. First, I'll discuss the potential ways that Dumbledore could have stopped his fall mid-air and escaped. The first possibility surrounds a spell that we actually see Dumbledore use in an earlier film, Arresto Momentum, which is used to slow the velocity of an object. The next possibility is that Dumbledore had a broom stashed somewhere and used Accio to summon it mid-fall. The next possibility is that Dumbledore simply apparated. We see Dumbledore apparating constantly, and he seems to be one of the only people not bound by the restriction of no apparating within Hogwarts. Dumbledore placed many of the enchantments on Hogwarts, so it's not unreasonable to assume that he would also be able to lift them. The next possibility ties into an old theory of mine, which suggests that Dumbledore is in fact an unregistered animagus. We know for a fact that one's Patronus form generally provides insight into what one's animagus form would be. We also know that Dumbledore's Patronus is a phoenix, so I'm suggesting this. After being thrown over the battlements, Dumbledore simply turned into his Phoenix Animagus form, flying away. Everyone would have thought it was just Fawkes. And on that note, my final explanation for how Dumbledore could have prevented his fall is that he was simply saved by Fawkes, caught mid-air and brought to safety. Dumbledore surviving the fall is a lovely thought, but one big issue that we still have to consider is his body. Doesn't Dumbledore have an entire funeral? If he survived, then how can his motionless corpse be reasonably explained? Well, I don't think it's entirely impossible to deduce that Snape, a potions expert, could have created some sort of concoction for Dumbledore to drink upon his safe landing. A concoction that would bewitch the mind, ensnare the senses, and, in a roundabout way, put a stopper in death. It's also entirely possible that Dumbledore and Snape had used Polyjuice Potion on an unnamed but deceased Death Eater, leaving the body of that wizard behind while Dumbledore escaped. It should also be mentioned that Dumbledore surviving doesn't impact the plot that follows his death. Before his death, while still in possession of the Elder Wand, Dumbledore was disarmed by Draco, and it's been proven that ownership can be gained simply through disarming and does not necessarily require death. Therefore, Dumbledore surviving does not disrupt the path of ownership that the wand eventually follows. These theories may be a bit far-fetched, but I do like a good theory, and I certainly don't like to imagine that Dumbledore fell brutally to his death. Today, we're going to be discussing Hogwarts Headmaster Albus Dumbledore and trying to unravel one of his dirtiest, darkest secrets. As early as the Philosopher's Stone, in the first chapter no less, we hear Dumbledore mention a certain scar in a conversation with McGonagall. But it's not the scar that you probably thought of, Harry's scar of legend. It's actually one of Dumbledore's own scars. If the first place your mind went to was emotional scars, then that would make perfect sense, as Dumbledore, who lived quite the tumultuous life, would be riddled with them. But in this instance, we're talking about a real, bona fide scar. The following is Dumbledore's response to McGonagall's query about whether or not he could remove Harry's scar. Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that is a perfect map of the London Underground. For those unaware, the London Underground is a public transport network of underground railways in London, also called the Tube. In this case, Dumbledore is referring to the Tube Map, which is a map used by travellers on the Underground. However, it's not simply an overlay of the railway lines onto a map of London, it's a simplified version of lines to make it easier to follow. Some may have interpreted this little quip as some sort of joke, but as it happens, J.K. Rowling has since confirmed that this scar on Dumbledore's left knee was very much real. The problem, however, is that she never revealed how he got it, even avoiding the answer at a public Q&A 7 years after the first book's release. How did Dumbledore get his scar of the London Underground? You may find out one day. I'm very fond of that scar. And now, 25 years after the release of the first book, this question, like so many others, remains unanswered. Today, we're going to be diving in and figuring out the cause of Dumbledore's famous scar. I've got two very different theories. My first theory is that Dumbledore got the scar while trying to protect his sister, Ariana. When Ariana Dumbledore was just 6 years old, she was brutally attacked by 3 Muggle boys. It was this incident that led to a permanent inability to control her magical abilities, as well as the imprisonment of the Dumbledore family's patriarch, Percival Dumbledore. When Percival first got the news about what had happened to his daughter, he went and furiously attacked the 3 Muggle boys in a bout of rage. For his crimes, he was sentenced to Azkaban, and after he got locked up, the family moved from Mold-on-the-Wold to Godric's Hollow. Proud and haughty, Kendra Dumbledore could not bear to remain in Mold-on-the-Wold after her husband Percival's well-publicized arrest and imprisonment in Azkaban. She therefore decided to uproot the family and relocate to Godric's Hollow, the village that was later to gain fame as the scene of Harry Potter's strange escape from you-know-who. With Dumbledore's father out of the picture, Albus knew that he would have to step up and be strong for his family. With Percival locked away, who would protect Ariana? My theory is that after moving to Godric's Hollow, bullying of Ariana persisted. But with no Percival around to step in, Albus had to do it. It was now his responsibility. And on one occasion, while protecting Ariana, Albus sustained some injuries. Specifically, a scar that, oddly, looked like a map of the London Underground. And even though Albus wanted to defeat these bullies, to punish them, he couldn't. Because you see, Albus, one of the most powerful wizards of his time, couldn't use his vast magical arsenal. If he did, he would have secured the same fate as his father, a sentence to Azkaban. Instead, Albus simply took the beating and allowed his sister to escape. From that moment on, it became entirely clear that Ariana was too vulnerable to be out on her own, and the family tried their best to accommodate an interesting, but certainly more sheltered life for her. But now you may be asking yourself, wasn't Dumbledore supposed to be fond of this scar? Why would he be fond of a memory that involved him getting beaten up? The truth is, Albus did very little for his sister in his early years, and her death, which came almost as a direct result of him putting her in harm's way, was one of his greatest regrets. Her death was the reason Dumbledore put on Marvolo Gaunt's ring. It's the reason he had no fear of death. Dying just meant that he might be presented with another opportunity to see his sister and make amends. Dumbledore was fond of the scar on his knee because it represented protecting his little sister while not letting his emotions get the better of him. He was fond of it because it symbolized one profoundly kind act towards the sister that he otherwise let down again and again. It was the one time he truly stepped up and allowed himself to be the big brother that she needed. In death, we can only hope that they were reunited. My second theory is that Dumbledore got the scar during his final duel with Grindelwald in 1945, a personal reminder to Dumbledore of the famous duel that many would describe as the most epic in wizarding history. They say still that no wizarding duel ever matched that between Dumbledore and Grindelwald in 1945. Those who witnessed it have written of the terror and the awe they felt as they watched these two extraordinary wizards do battle. Dumbledore's triumph and its consequences for the wizarding world are considered a turning point in magical history to match the introduction of the International Statute of Secrecy or the downfall of he who must not be named. Albus Dumbledore was never proud or vain. He could find something to value in anyone, however apparently insignificant or wretched, and I believe that his early losses endowed him with great humanity and sympathy. What if Dumbledore got a scar of the London Underground because he dueled Grindelwald inside of the London Underground? With spells blasting all over the place, it doesn't sound entirely outside the realm of possibility for a spell to have bounced off of a wall map, becoming somewhat infused with the pattern and subsequently permeating itself into Dumbledore's skin. Spells in Harry Potter have historically exhibited all sorts of strange properties, and this seems like just the kind of strange but oddly significant thing that could happen to someone like Dumbledore. The only problem with this theory is that the latest Fantastic Beasts films seem to predominantly take place in countries beside Britain, and I've always been of the impression that their final duel took place on Grindelwald's home turf. This is reinforced by the fact that Grindelwald ended up being imprisoned in Nurmengard rather than Azkaban. Furthermore, if this was indeed how he got the scar, why would this scenario cause Dumbledore to be fond of it? Given how close Grindelwald and Dumbledore were, you'd imagine that a scar reminding him of their battle would elicit bad memories. But here's the thing, defeating Grindelwald wasn't all bad. By defeating Grindelwald, Albus Dumbledore helped save the wizarding world and many, many lives. He put others first and himself second. Yes, he had to fight the man that he once loved, but in one fell swoop he was able to both save the day and keep Grindelwald alive. Grindelwald's defeat also represented a shift in his perspective. After being finally defeated by Dumbledore, he inevitably came to the realization that he had always been wrong, and this is reflected by the fact that he never even tried to escape Nurmengard. He knew that he got what he deserved, and that he would need to pay his penance. Seeing Grindelwald like that must have brought Dumbledore great joy, despite the lengths that he had to go to prompt this realization. Today, we're going to be discussing Albus Dumbledore and his cursed hand. More specifically, we're going to be breaking down Dumbledore's death, the curse itself, and one scenario in which maybe, just maybe, Dumbledore could have saved himself. Let's get into it. Months before Dumbledore's tragic demise, Dumbledore himself had decided to track down one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, a small ring crowned with a strange, dark stone. And what made this particular Horcrux unique is that this stone was in fact one of the fabled Deathly Hallows, the Resurrection Stone to be precise. The history of the stone dates back some time, with its origin story suggesting that it had been given to the middle Peverell brother, Cadmus Peverell, by Death himself. Then the second brother, who was an arrogant man, decided that he wanted to humiliate Death still further, and asked for the power to recall others from death. So Death picked up a stone from the riverbank and gave it to the second brother, and told him that the stone would have the power to bring back the dead. As mentioned above, this stone had the power to summon spirits back from the dead, but when Voldemort stole his Uncle Morfin's ring years and years prior, he had no idea that it contained such a powerful relic. To him, it was just a family heirloom, and, more importantly, an item that he could taint with dark magic, an item he could turn into a Horcrux. But when Albus first found the stone and noticed its distinct markings, he immediately realized that it was one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. Knowing the true power of the stone, Dumbledore's curiosity got the better of him, and he ended up placing the ring on his finger, securing his fate. In the end, it was the allure of the Resurrection Stone that prompted Dumbledore to slide the ring onto his finger and receive Voldemort's lethal curse. Why did he do it? Well, to Dumbledore, the stone represented one last chance at seeing his sister, Ariana, who tragically died decades and decades prior. Did Dumbledore know that the ring was a Horcrux? Yes, but the allure of the stone caused a momentary lapse in his judgment, resulting in him being afflicted with a lethal curse. Just like all of Voldemort's Horcruxes, he had protected it with dark magic, and this particular Horcrux would curse anyone who tried the ring on. When I discovered it, after all those years, buried in the abandoned home of the Gaunts, the Hallow had craved most of all, though in my youth I'd wanted it for very different reasons. I lost my head, Harry. I quite forgot that it was now a Horcrux, that the ring was sure to carry a curse. I picked it up and I put it on, and for a second I imagined that I was about to see Ariana, and my mother and my father, and to tell them how very, very sorry I was. And immediately after placing the cursed ring on his finger, Dumbledore realizes that his clock is ticking. His time is running out. Fortunately, thanks to Snape and his expertise in curses and potions, Dumbledore was able to buy some time, but he still didn't have much of it. He knew that ultimately the curse would kill him. With Snape's help, the curse was confined to a single hand, granting the headmaster some extra time alive. However, I think that it's important to remember that had Dumbledore been a lesser wizard, the curse would have stopped his heart on the spot. Because of the way that Dumbledore was able to handle his affliction, many interpreted this curse to be some sort of slow-acting killing charm, but this is not the case. It took every bit of Dumbledore's strength and Snape's experience to halt the progression of the curse, and in this respect, Dumbledore was very, very lucky. My question is this: if Dumbledore's curse had been effectively confined to a single hand, why not just chop it off? Snape said it himself that the curse had been temporarily contained. The main concern surrounding Dumbledore's survival was that the curse would eventually spread further. To me, chopping it off seems like the logical solution here. I've got a couple of things to say about this. Dumbledore would have lost a hand, sure, but that would have been a small price to pay for survival. If we think back on the series, then one character comes to mind who chops off his hand for less, much less. Wormtail was whimpering. He pulled a long, thin, shining silver dagger from inside his cloak. His voice broke into petrified sobs. "Flesh of the servant, willingly given, you will revive your master." He stretched his right hand out in front of him, the hand with the missing finger. He gripped the dagger very tightly in his left hand and swung it upward. Harry realized what Wormtail was about to do a second before it happened. He closed his eyes as tightly as he could, but he could not block the scream that pierced the night, that went through Harry as though he had been stabbed with a dagger too. Here's the thing, the curse was completely uncharted territory, even for Dumbledore and Snape. Neither of them had ever dealt with a curse like that. Yes, I suppose they could have cut Dumbledore's hand off after confining the curse, but who's to say that the curse was really confined? What if they cut his hand off only to realize that the curse then transferred itself to the rest of his body? What if this type of curse clings on to the living entity of the victim until they die, until they've let out every last breath? Then Dumbledore would be cursed and handless. There's also the possibility that cutting off his hand would have killed him sooner. With no hand, Snape's preventative measures would no longer be in place, and it's entirely possible that the curse would have immediately killed him. What if this previously contained curse suddenly now affected all of Dumbledore? Well, all of that is possible, but I suppose the only options for Dumbledore at this stage were die slowly or cut off the hand and see what happens. But let's pretend for a second that cutting off the hand was a surefire way of keeping Dumbledore alive. In this case, why not do it? Unsure of what might happen, I can imagine both Snape's and Dumbledore's reluctance on the matter. Snape would have to butcher someone, an act I'm sure he'd find repulsive, and Dumbledore would run the risk of either dying right away or being more helpless for his final days while remaining cursed. Dumbledore was used to being, well, Dumbledore, and being a less powerful version of himself can't have been too inviting a prospect for the most powerful wizard of all time. Now, let's suppose that cutting off the hand would work, and both Snape and Dumbledore knew it would work. There's still one problem: Malfoy. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape enters into an unbreakable vow where he agrees to protect Draco, help him with his task of killing Dumbledore, and even finish it himself should Draco fail. Draco's mission to kill Dumbledore was given to him by Voldemort himself, and I'm sure that Dumbledore knew that if Draco were to fail in this mission, then he would be punished severely by Voldemort. At the end of the day, Dumbledore had a plan in motion that accounted for his death, and on a personal level, he was simply ready to embrace death. I know that Dumbledore placing the ring on his finger has often been interpreted as a foolish, impulsive decision made out of desperation, but what we have to remember here is that this is Dumbledore, a beacon of wisdom. More likely is this: when Dumbledore saw the Resurrection Stone set in the ring as a Horcrux, he began to lament at how much of a selfish fool he had been in his youth. Then, in a moment blaring of poetic justice, he chose to put the cursed ring on, so that he could join his family in the afterlife and find forgiveness in death. Dumbledore had lived too long without love, and it was his time to move on. Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love. In today's video, we're going to be discussing Albus Dumbledore, Severus Snape, and the Half-Blood Prince. More specifically, I'm going to be discussing what I expect to be quite a controversial theory, as it surrounds the iconic, albeit equally tragic, death of Hogwarts Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. Let's set the scene with the passage from Chapter 27, The Lightning-Struck Tower. Snape said nothing, but walked forwards and pushed Malfoy roughly out of the way. The three Death Eaters fell back without a word. Even the werewolf seemed cowed. Snape gazed for a moment at Dumbledore, and there was revulsion and hatred etched in the harsh lines of his face. "Severus, please." Snape raised his wand and pointed it directly at Dumbledore. "Avada Kedavra!" A jet of green light shot from the end of Snape's wand and hit Dumbledore squarely in the chest. Harry's scream of horror never left him. Silent and unmoving, he was forced to watch as Dumbledore was blasted into the air. For a split second, he seemed to hang suspended beneath the shining skull, and then he fell slowly backwards, like a great rag doll, over the battlements and out of sight. The above passage, of course, refers to Dumbledore's death at the hands of Severus Snape, a moment that shocked the wizarding world to its core. Dumbledore, in some ways, was a beacon of hope for the good guys, a powerful and wise old wizard that even Voldemort feared. But when he was struck with Snape's Avada Kedavra, that all changed, and in that moment, Harry felt more helpless than ever. Dumbledore's death was a big deal. He was 115 years old and had made a profound impact on the wizarding world over the course of his life. His death also raised a lot of questions. How could the wise and powerful Dumbledore be defeated in such a paltry manner? Surely, if he had wanted to survive, he could have, right? Well, today's theory is going to discuss why I think that Dumbledore may still very well be alive. First, let's take a look at why Dumbledore opted to die, or at least opted to appear to die. What it really boils down to is the unbreakable vow that Snape had made with Narcissa. In this vow, Snape vowed to both watch over Draco, as well as take action on Draco's part in the event that he was unable. And what was Draco's assignment? Kill Albus Dumbledore. "Will you, Severus, watch over my son, Draco, as he attempts to fulfill the Dark Lord's wishes?" "I will," said Snape. A thin tongue of brilliant flame issued from the wand and wound its way around their hands like a red-hot wire. "And will you, to the best of your ability, protect him from harm?" "I will," said Snape. By taking on the responsibility of killing Dumbledore in the event that Draco was unable, he was essentially saving Draco. But why, you might ask, would Snape willingly enter such a vow? Well, I've got a few ideas. The obvious answer here would be that Dumbledore was sick and going to die anyway, and by offering to kill him, he was essentially providing Dumbledore with a less painful way out. However, I'm of the impression that Snape agreed to the vow because he never intended on killing Dumbledore at all. Snape and Dumbledore were both master tacticians and accomplished occlumens, masters of the mind, so surely it isn't unreasonable to assume that Dumbledore's death was simply orchestrated by them. With that said, let's look at the facts here. Dumbledore died as a direct result of Snape's killing curse, or Avada Kedavra. Snape simply pointed his wand and stated the incantation, and following this, Dumbledore flew into the air for a brief moment before falling over the battlements and out of sight. The details that I want to hone in on here are the spell that Snape used, as well as the fall of Dumbledore. To kill Dumbledore, Snape uses Avada Kedavra, an unforgivable curse with a simple purpose: instantly kill your victim. The spell creates a blindingly intense green bolt of light right before the victim simply drops dead. But what if Snape didn't use Avada Kedavra at all? From a very young age, Snape was a magical prodigy, a talented student that went above and beyond what was expected of him in school. His own copy of Advanced Potion Making, which propelled Harry through his potions class, contained notes that improved upon the methods recommended by the authors of such textbooks, and he was able to do this at a very young age. Possessing Snape's textbook was like having cheat codes to potions lessons, but potion-making advice wasn't all that was inside. There were spells as well, spells that Harry had never seen before. Most notably, Snape had invented the spell Sectum Sempra, a vicious dark curse that acts like an invisible sword, causing lacerations, hemorrhaging, and cuts upon its target. In short, Snape has a demonstrated ability to invent, create his own spells. So, is it really out of the question for him to have invented a faux Avada Kedavra, a spell that sounds, looks, and feels so similar that only its creator would be able to assess its validity? I don't think so. Perhaps this version of Avada Kedavra still kills the victim, but only temporarily, or maybe it just paralyzes your body entirely, giving everyone the impression that you're dead. Maybe it just does nothing, and the victim plays dead. In the film adaptation of The Half-Blood Prince, Snape's Avada Kedavra appears to contain an awful lot of blue, and strays somewhat away from the green that we had become accustomed to in previous films. This could potentially further suggest that the Avada Kedavra Snape used wasn't actually Avada Kedavra at all, but instead a spell of his own creation. The alternative to this theory, and one that's more in line with the books, is that Snape did genuinely use Avada Kedavra, hence producing the green light mentioned in the books. However, if Snape were to have used Avada Kedavra on Dumbledore, I'm of the impression that it wouldn't have worked. In order for Avada Kedavra or any unforgivable curse to truly be effective, you must truly loathe that person, and if you don't, then a less effective version of the spell will be produced. We see this when Harry tries to use the Cruciatus curse on Bellatrix. Despite his sheer anger, he still wasn't able to use the spell to its true effect. Yes, Snape fired a killing blow at Dumbledore, but because Snape lacked the emotions necessary to produce the spell in its full capacity, Dumbledore was able to survive. But wait, he still fell off the tower, didn't he? Well, there are a few ways for him to have survived the fall. The first possibility surrounds a spell that we actually see Dumbledore use in an earlier film, Arresto Momentum, which is used to slow the velocity of an object. I would imagine that, in this scenario, Dumbledore was either conscious enough to cast the spell himself, or it was built into the spell that Snape had created. An alternative to Arresto Momentum being used links back to another theory of mine, and that's that Dumbledore is in fact an unregistered animagus. We know for a fact that one's Patronus form generally provides insight into what one's animagus form would be. We also know that Dumbledore's Patronus is a phoenix, so I'm suggesting this. After being thrown over the battlements, Dumbledore simply turned into his phoenix animagus form, flying away. Everyone would have thought it was just Fawkes. Other plausible alternatives are that he was able to apparate, caught by his broom, or saved by Fawkes. Okay, now I've got another element to address, his body. Doesn't Dumbledore have an entire funeral? If he survived, then how can his motionless corpse be reasonably explained? Well, I don't think it's entirely impossible to deduce that Snape, a potions expert, could have created some sort of concoction for Dumbledore to drink upon his safe landing. A concoction that would bewitch the mind, ensnare the senses, and in a roundabout way, put a stopper in death. It should also be mentioned that Dumbledore surviving doesn't impact the plot that follows his death. Before his death, while still in possession of the Elder Wand, Dumbledore was disarmed by Draco, and it's been proven that ownership can be gained simply through disarming, and does not necessarily require death. Therefore, Dumbledore surviving does not disrupt the path of ownership that the Wand eventually follows. As for Snape and the vow, yes, he agreed to carry out Draco's deed, but it should also be mentioned that there was no time limit on that term, so there's certainly no reason that he would have dropped dead simply from casting a different spell on Dumbledore in that moment. As for Dumbledore's hand, I think the prodigious minds of Snape and Dumbledore, along with the help of Fawkes' tears, could have figured out a remedy. In today's video, we're going to be discussing why in the name of Merlin's beard, Albus Dumbledore, one of the most celebrated and extraordinary wizards of his time, put on a cursed ring that ultimately led to his death. Let's begin with Dumbledore's claims as to how he ended up putting the ring on. He found it in the ancestral home of the Gaunt family, just outside of Little Hangleton. The ring belonged to Marvolo Gaunt, a pureblood wizard, descendant of Salazar Slytherin, whose family was a member of the Sacred 28. By all accounts, not a great bunch. Anyway, Dumbledore was hunting Voldemort's Horcruxes, and when he saw this particular one, he said he immediately knew that, set within the ring, he had found the Deathly Hallow that he had always craved most, the Resurrection Stone. Of course, Dumbledore undoubtedly knew the ring to be cursed, as he knew that it had been turned into a Horcrux by Voldemort. However, he claims that in his excitement over recovering the stone at long last, he quite forgot that it was a most dangerous item indeed, as he explains to Harry after his death, while the two catch up in limbo. After another short pause, Harry said, You tried to use the resurrection stone. Dumbledore nodded. When I discovered it, after all those years, buried in the abandoned home of the Gaunts, the Hallow I had craved most of all, though in my youth I'd wanted it for very different reasons. I lost my head, Harry. I quite forgot that it was now a Horcrux, that the ring was sure to carry a curse. I picked it up and I put it on, and for a second I imagined that I was about to see Ariana and my mother and my father, and to tell them how very, very sorry I was. Now, honestly, are we supposed to believe that one of the greatest wizards of all time simply lost his head and foolishly put on a cursed ring, a ring that he'd been searching for because it was a Horcrux? This just doesn't sit right with me. How could Dumbledore, have truly lost himself enough to go through with putting the ring on his finger? I could understand forgetting oneself at first, seeing the item you've been searching for your entire life, which for Dumbledore was, of course, quite a long time, but to see it, pick it up and put it on, I just don't see how he could have been so beside himself that he would get all the way to actually wearing the ring. I think this point is further proven in the memories that Snape shares with Harry before his death, particularly in the scene in which Severus helps Dumbledore stanch the effects of the ring's curse. "Why," said Snape, without preamble, "why did you put on that ring? It carries a curse. Surely you realize that. Why even touch it?" Marvolocort's ring lay on the desk before Dumbledore. It was cracked. The sword of Gryffindor lay beside it. "If only you had summoned me a little earlier, I might have been able to do more, buy you more time," said Snape furiously. Snape cuts right to the point here. Why didn't Dumbledore summon him sooner? I guess you could argue that he was delirious from the effects of the cursed ring. He was in pain and unable to identify what he needed to do in order to save himself. But again, Dumbledore was an extraordinary wizard, one who was able to defeat the Gellert Grindelwald, and was well on his way to undermining the source of dark magic behind Voldemort's immortality. He was powerful beyond measure. He was intelligent. Surely he would have realized he needed help. And alright, maybe he didn't want Severus to know that the ring was a Horcrux, so he needed to destroy it with the sword of Gryffindor first. But then that only further shows that he was sound enough of mind to carry out his well-laid plans after putting on the ring and being affected by the curse. So the question remains, if Dumbledore knew what he was doing in putting on the Horcrux and letting its effects set in just long enough to ultimately lead to his death, why in Merlin's beard did he put on that damn ring? I guess you could argue that he did it to save Draco Malfoy's life, and further push Snape into Lord Voldemort's inner circle of Death Eaters. After all, it's one of the first things he says to Severus after acknowledging that the effects of the curse are incurable. Well, really, this makes matters much more straightforward. I refer to the plan Lord Voldemort is revolving around me, his plan to have the poor Malfoy boy murder me. But in my opinion, that seems like too small of gain for sacrificing his own life. No offense to Draco and Severus. So then perhaps Dumbledore was feeling guilty about the fact that he had mentored Harry just to have him die in order to defeat Voldemort. Having come to know and care for our dear boy Harry, as they were nearing the end of their journey towards overcoming the Dark Lord and Harry's inevitable self-sacrifice, perhaps Dumbledore was feeling like he too should make a sacrifice in the name of the greater good. But again, the gains from sacrificing himself in this way seem too insignificant, at least to me, in order for that to be the real reason why he put on the ring. Which brings us to my theory on why Dumbledore put it on. I think that after all those years of lamenting the loss of parents and sister, and feeling terribly guilty for the part he played in each of their deaths, he was ready and willing to face death himself and join them in the afterlife to make amends. Of course, Dumbledore could hardly be blamed for the death of his father, Percival Dumbledore, who died in Azkaban after being sent there for attacking a group of young muggles. However, Percival's actions were a retaliation for the attack on his daughter, Dumbledore's sister, Ariana. Percival only went after the muggles after they had traumatized Ariana to the point that suppressed her magic and became somewhat dangerous herself. So it could be said that if Albus had been around to help protect his sister from this attack, his father may have never gone to prison, and his sister may have gone on to be a normal witch. But I digress. I do believe that he had certain feelings of guilt for not being around when Ariana lost control of her magic and accidentally killed their mother. And then he definitely felt responsible for Ariana's death, which was the direct result of an argument turned fight between Dumbledore and Grindelwald as young men, Aberforth too. Although he was never quite sure who cast the spell that killed her, he certainly felt a profound amount of guilt for the part he played in her death. If he had been more careful around his family, or if he hadn't been so caught up in his pursuit of the Deathly Hallows and the loss of his freedom, he could have prevented this tragedy from happening. So when, after all these years, as an older wizard, he finally comes face to face with the one magical item that could reunite him with his loved ones, he would have us believe that he lost his head and put the ring on if only to see them one last time. But I think what truly happened was that he saw the resurrection stone set in the ring as a Horcrux, lamented how much of a selfish fool he had been in his youth, and then, in a moment blaring of poetic justice, he chose to put the cursed ring on, so that he could join his family in the afterlife and find forgiveness in death. Perhaps after putting the ring on, he realizes that he could get a bit more done and benefit from being terminally ill, as it were. So before the curse completely overtook him, he destroyed the Horcrux and summoned Snape. From there, he was able to kill multiple birds with one stone. Sorry, couldn't help myself. Anyways, as I was saying, he was able to use his prolonged death to help save Malfoy, further entrench Snape into Voldemort's good graces, help Harry get his hands on another Horcrux, and ultimately reunite himself with his deceased loved ones. The final reason being his one true motivation behind putting on Marvolo Gaunt's cursed ring. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the moral leanings of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, beloved Hogwarts professor and eventual headmaster, loyal member of the Order of the Phoenix, and potentially dark wizard? Now, don't get me wrong, Dumbledore was a majorly positive influence on our dear boy Harry, providing him with guidance in the wizarding world and taking a special interest in the boy who lived upon his arrival at Hogwarts. I also want to make my stance on Dumbledore abundantly clear. He's one of my favourite characters, so this is not a shot at him. This is just a fun theory to explore. But what if Dumbledore's influence, his interest in Harry, came from a selfish, dark place rather than a selfless, compassionate one? Could it be that Albus Dumbledore only mentored Harry, only ever did things that appeared good in general to satisfy his own need to be clever, to be powerful, and ultimately to achieve glory? Let's take a look at the facts. I've got 3 for you today. Number 1. If Dumbledore truly cared for Harry, why did he abuse him so often? I don't mean abuse in the physical sense, of course, although there were quite a few times where he sent Harry off to do some very questionable, very dangerous things, but in terms of emotional abuse, Dumbledore left Harry alone to suffer almost too many times to count. The first time was when Harry was just a baby. For some odd reason, not agreed upon by anyone else, I might add, namely Minerva McGonagall and Hagrid, Dumbledore chose to place a newly orphaned infant Harry in the care of the Dursleys. He did this knowing of the volatile and strained relationship between Lily Potter, Harry's mother, and her sister Petunia. And with witches like Arabella Figg, the Dursleys' neighbour who would frequently care for Harry when the Dursleys would go out to do something fun without Harry, of course, Dumbledore was certainly aware of how Harry was being treated over at number 4 Privet Drive. I mean, Harry's letter of acceptance to Hogwarts was literally made out to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, number 4 Privet Drive. So Dumbledore clearly knew of the abuse Harry was experiencing. And yet, he remained in the care of the Dursleys for an entire decade, and no one seemed to be too concerned when he continued to return to Privet Drive each and every summer either. But yes, I know what you're thinking. Didn't Harry have to live there in order to remain safe? Dumbledore even explains this to Harry himself. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort. He shed her blood, but it lives on in you and her sister. Her blood became your refuge. You need return there only once a year, but as long as you can still call it home, there he cannot hurt you. So, according to Dumbledore, at least, he had to be there. We know the power of love is real in Harry Potter, but living with the Dursleys, is that bit actually true? Or is this just another manipulation tactic used by Dumbledore as part of his scheme? Dumbledore also continued to be somewhat indifferent and mistrusting of Harry as the years progressed, despite claiming to care for him. He didn't seem to believe Harry when he said he didn't put his own name into the Goblet of Fire, for instance. And then, after the Triwizard Tournament ended, an incredibly traumatic event for Harry, instead of explaining to Harry his theory behind his link to Voldemort, or merely even comforting Harry, what did he do instead? He ignored him. Later, he claimed he only did this to keep Harry safe, but he actually didn't want Harry to know that he would inevitably have to die. More on this in a second. Dumbledore then continued to withhold important information from him right up until his death, leaving a teenage Harry to decipher complex riddles and clues, hunt down dangerous magical items, and ultimately come up against one of the most powerful dark wizards of all time, Voldemort. It's also worth pointing out that Dumbledore has also earned a lot of disapproval from fans over the years, who believed he mentored Harry for only one despicable reason: to be raised like a pig for slaughter. We have protected him because it has been essential to teach him, to raise him, to let him try his strength, said Dumbledore, his eyes still tight shut. Meanwhile, the connection between them grows ever stronger, a parasitic growth. Sometimes I have thought he suspects it himself. If I know him, he will have arranged matters so that when he does set out to meet his death, it will truly mean the end of Voldemort. Dumbledore opened his eyes. Snape looked horrified. You have kept him alive so that he can die at the right moment? Don't be shocked, Severus. How many men and women have you watched die? Dumbledore knew, and quite frankly didn't sound too distraught, about the fact that Harry would have to give his life in order to defeat Voldemort. He provided him with just enough guidance to have him become a compassionate, powerful young wizard who would be willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Number 2. The wizards who Dumbledore chose to be loyal to was also questionable, to say the least. The most obvious example is, of course, Dumbledore's affiliation with the infamous wizard Gellert Grindelwald, who was considered to be one of the most dangerous wizards of all time. Grindelwald and Dumbledore struck up an intense relationship as young men over their shared interest in power and the pursuit of the 3 Deathly Hallows. While Dumbledore eventually realized how far into dark magic and hate Grindelwald was willing to take his ideologies, it took decades before he was willing to challenge him in a duel. He eventually did in 1945 at the height of Grindelwald's power. But why did it take so long, you might ask? Likely a couple of reasons. Since the release of the books, J.K. Rowling has revealed that Dumbledore was in fact in love with Grindelwald. Then, one of their final confrontations before going their separate ways as young men led to the death of Dumbledore's sister, Ariana. So, he was in love with a psychopath, and not even the death of a family member was enough to make him go after him. Quite an unwavering loyalty to a very wicked wizard, not the best look for Dumbledore. On a much lesser scale, in terms of loyalties to dark wizards, Dumbledore seemed to have interesting taste when it came to who he employed at Hogwarts. Obviously, he also gave well-intentioned and talented magical folks career opportunities, the likes of Hagrid and Sybil Trelawney falling into the well-intentioned category, and professors like Remus Lupin falling into the talented and good category. But he also chose wizards like Quirinus Quirrell and Horace Slughorn to take up postings at Hogwarts. It's hard to believe that a wizard with Dumbledore's experience and power wouldn't have been able to tell that something was really quite off about Quirrell. I mean, the man had Voldemort's soul living on the back of his head. Dumbledore also went quite out of his way to offer Slughorn a job. Now, I know he wanted Slughorn's help in determining exactly how Voldemort split his soul, but did he really have to give him a paying job in order to get that information out of him? After all, Slughorn was a man of questionable morality, putting together a club for his most talented students, showing a shallow enthusiasm for knowing students who would go on to be great, despite seeing darkness in some of them, including, you guessed it, a young Tom Riddle. On the flip side of that coin, Dumbledore didn't always show the most loyalty towards otherwise good wizards. For example, being in the Order of the Phoenix and watching him come up in Hogwarts with James Potter, I would have expected Dumbledore to ask more questions when it came to Sirius Black and the death of James and Lily. Not only did he do nothing to uncover the truth of what happened before Sirius was imprisoned in Azkaban, Dumbledore even went as far as to allow Dementors to roam school grounds in an effort to protect students after Sirius escaped from prison. Number 3. The third and final piece of evidence that I've got for you guys today is, I would say, his most unforgivable: the mistreatment of his family. We've already covered the fact that he was part of the duel that led to the death of his younger sister, Ariana. Whether he was at fault for the spell that killed her or not remains beside the point. If he hadn't been so careless around his family, you could argue that the tragedy could have been avoided altogether. But even before that, as a young man filled with pride, he resented that he must care for his damaged sister after she accidentally killed their mother in an outburst of uncontrollable magic. In order to come take care of Ariana, Albus had to cancel a trip around the world with his friend, Ulfias Doge. Oh, the horrors. No, not really. And from my perspective, he seems much more distraught over the loss of his freedom than the loss of his mother. I resented it, Harry. Dumbledore stated it baldly, coldly. He was looking now, over the top of Harry's head, into the distance. I was gifted. I was brilliant. I wanted to escape. I wanted to shine. I wanted glory. Do not misunderstand me, he said, and pain crossed the face so that he looked ancient again. I loved them. I loved my parents. I loved my brother and my sister. But I was selfish, Harry. More selfish than you, who are a remarkably selfless person, could possibly imagine. So that, when my mother died and I was left the responsibility of a damaged sister and a wayward brother, I returned to my village in anger and bitterness. Trapped and wasted, I thought. So there you have it. In today's video, we're going to be discussing the first episode of the Harry Potter story, the one that hooked us, the Philosopher's or Sorcerer's Stone. Now, as an introduction to a new series, it doesn't get much better than the Philosopher's Stone. By the time you're just a few short chapters in, you're introduced to a magical world with endless possibilities, a world full of magic, wands, witches, wizards, and flying broomsticks. As a child, it was the best thing I had ever witnessed. The premise of the Philosopher's Stone surrounds, well, the Philosopher's Stone, a stone created by French alchemist Nicolas Flamel, with a breadth of powerful capabilities. The ancient study of alchemy is concerned with making the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary substance with astonishing powers. The stone will transform any metal into pure gold. It also produces the elixir of life, which will make the drinker immortal. Okay, so it's a powerful stone. But how exactly does it fit into the plot of Harry Potter? Here's the thing. Lord Voldemort, aka Tom Riddle, the primary antagonist of the Harry Potter story, always sought one thing: immortality. He wanted to live forever, and that's part of the reason that he went to such great lengths to create his Horcruxes, risking everything so that he wouldn't have to suffer as a consequence of his own mortality. Voldemort wanted to evade death at any cost, as he felt that it was a fate unbefitting of a man of his level of power. He despised his mother for dying and abandoning him. It was a fate reserved for the weak and unambitious. Needless to say, Voldemort knew about the stone and wanted it desperately. Flamel, the stone's creator, eventually entrusted its ownership to Hogwarts Headmaster Albus Dumbledore, as he knew that Dumbledore would be able to protect it much better than Flamel himself. Dumbledore took the task of protecting the stone very seriously, putting numerous safety measures in place to ensure that the stone was properly protected. However, I want to explore a few things in this video. Number one is, were the obstacles enough? If the stone was reached by a trio of first years, then how could it have been considered even remotely enough to hold off Voldemort? And number two, did Dumbledore in fact want Harry to reach the stone? Did he want him to reach Voldemort? Let's look further. In total, there were 8 obstacles in the way of the stone, with varying difficulties. Some were almost pointless, and others had some degree of difficulty. Obstacle number 1 was hardly an obstacle at all, a locked door. However, I'm pretty sure this one was just put in place to stop an unfortunate student from wandering in to the next obstacle, Fluffy. Fluffy was obstacle number 2, a giant 3-headed dog that guarded a trapdoor that would serve as an entryway to the remaining challenges protecting the stone. Despite Fluffy's immense size and unquestionable ability to kill, I don't think that anyone thought that he would truly hold Voldemort off. What they may have thought, however, is that the inevitable clash between Fluffy and Voldemort would have at least attracted some attention, enough attention to alert Dumbledore and the other professors. Obstacle number 3 was Devil's Snare, a magical plant that constricts and strangles anything that happens to fall into it. The Devil's Snare was waiting at the bottom of the trapdoor next to Fluffy, which meant that as soon as they had passed Fluffy, they were hit with another challenge. Here's the thing. Devil's Snare would be a great protective measure if only it wasn't countered with a spell taught in first year herbology. Probably not a great defense against, one of the most powerful dark wizards of all time.
Obstacle number 4 was a room filled with flying keys, one of which was the correct key to open the door to obstacle number 5. However, not only were there tons of flying keys, there was also a broom available for the taking. The moment that contact was made with the broom, the keys began flying around erratically, making it supremely difficult to try and capture the correct key. This obstacle is good, in theory, however, I do wonder why a broom would be provided at all. Surely, if the goal is protecting the stone by any means, then it doesn't make any kind of sense to make the goal of reaching the stone any more achievable. Also, I can't help but think that there could have simply been an alternate spell used on the door, avoiding the hassle of capturing a key altogether. Obstacle number 5 was the giant chess set, a magical obstacle put in place that required checkmating the enemy king to advance further. This obstacle is not bad, particularly as if you weren't a chess pro, you'd run into a considerable level of difficulty. The trio advanced through this challenge because of Ron, but it did divide the group, which was perhaps the intention of this challenge, separating people from any aid that they may have had thus far. As far as we can tell, Voldemort, Tom Riddle, was basically a prodigy, so I'm fairly certain that winning the game of chess would have been a breeze for him. Obstacle number 6 was the troll room, a room with a big old troll. However, fortunately for the trio, the troll was already unconscious. A disgusting smell filled their nostrils, making both of them pull their robes up over their noses. Eyes watering, they saw, flat on the floor in front of them, a troll even larger than the one they had tackled, out cold with a bloody lump on its head. Again, this kind of challenge may have been difficult for a regular witch or wizard, and certainly for a regular group of first years, but Voldemort, come on. Obstacle number 6 was the potion room, one of the better obstacles protecting the stone. The room contained 7 unlabeled potions and tested the intruder's logic. Along with the 7 unlabeled potions was a riddle written on a piece of paper. The potions themselves also trapped the intruder between black and purple flames. In order to correctly pass the flames, the intruder would have to solve the riddle. This obstacle was particularly efficient at its ability to divide groups, as there was only enough potion to allow one individual through. The complexity of this particular obstacle made it, in my opinion, the only real obstacle so far. Harry was able to get through with the intellect of Hermione. However, as I mentioned earlier, Voldemort was prodigious himself. Obstacle number 8 was the Mirror of Erised. With the exception of the potions obstacle, the Mirror of Erised was, in my opinion, the only real protection of the stone. In case you've forgotten how the Mirror of Erised works, it's a magical mirror that shows us the deepest, most desperate desires of our hearts. The mirror was Dumbledore's primary contribution to the stone's protection. I'll let Dumbledore explain his thinking here. Only a person who wanted to find the stone, find it but not use it, would be able to get it. That is one of my more brilliant ideas, and between you and me, that is saying something. As Dumbledore mentioned above, when you arrived at the mirror obstacle, the only way to get the stone would be to see yourself possessing it in the mirror. This is where things would get tricky for Voldemort. Anyone that wanted to use the stone for their own purposes simply couldn't have it. However, here's why I still don't think it was well protected. Dumbledore knew that Harry would reach the stone. Dumbledore wasn't an oblivious man. He knew all about Harry, the prophecy, and Voldemort. He knew that Harry would be the one to defeat him, and he knew that the pair were destined to meet at some point or another. From the very beginning of the first book, Harry is given clues regarding the stone's existence. While in Diagon Alley with Hagrid, Hagrid decides to bring Harry with him to Gringotts and collect the stone, when he very well could have just done that by himself any other time. Why would he have combined shopping with Harry with such an important task, if not to somehow, subtly, alert Harry to the stone's existence? Was it Hagrid's ignorance, or was it perhaps, instruction from Dumbledore? With the existence of the stone planted in Harry's mind, he was bound to be curious. What was this mysterious object they picked up from the vault, and why, just after retrieving the stone with Hagrid, was the vault targeted by thieves? Dumbledore was no fool. He knew that Harry's curiosity was going to get the better of him, and that is why I think that he planned for Voldemort and Harry's encounter, to test the bounds of the prophecy and just how linked the pair really were. The obstacles put in place to prevent Voldemort from retrieving the stone were really just obstacles for Harry, tests that would determine whether or not Harry really was the boy who lived, and the boy that was destined to defeat Voldemort. They were formalities, a way of giving the outward appearance of protecting the stone while planning on having Harry reach the stone all along. Knowing that Hagrid would always look after Harry's best interest, Dumbledore kept Hagrid in the dark, mostly, but instructed him to subtly mention the existence of the stone without ever explaining why. Dumbledore's intentions weren't bad, but they weren't good either. He essentially put all of the parameters in place for Harry to face the Dark Lord himself, and watched on eagerly and in secret as Harry progressed through each trial with his friends. When Harry finally reached the chamber and was faced with Voldemort, Dumbledore's attention peaked, as this was the moment that would determine whether or not Harry was the real deal. The events that transpired in that chamber were what would shape Harry's life for the remainder of his time at Hogwarts, as once Dumbledore realized what and who Harry was, he subtly influenced the course of his life so that the prophecy could be fulfilled and Voldemort could be defeated. In one of my last videos, I discussed Sirius Black's imprisonment and why I felt that he was never properly exonerated for his alleged crimes which were of course committed by Peter Pettigrew. In 1981, shortly after Voldemort had just been defeated, Black tracked Pettigrew down and found him in a small Muggle town. It was in this town that Pettigrew murdered 12 Muggles, using a dark and powerful blasting curse, simultaneously destroying hundreds of feet of sewer system and leaving a 40-foot crater in the ground. After this happened, Pettigrew cut off part of his right index finger and escaped into the sewers in his animagus form, a rat. This is how Sirius Black was framed for Pettigrew's crimes. However, more specifically, I addressed why I thought it was that Sirius was kept in Azkaban for such a long time, 12 years. Sirius was a member of the Order of the Phoenix, and Dumbledore was its leader. Surely Dumbledore, one of the wisest wizards of all time and a legitimacy master, could have figured out Sirius's innocence. Unless, of course, he didn't want to. In this video, I'm going to be exploring the possibility that Dumbledore knew of Sirius's innocence all along, but allowed Sirius to rot in prison. It's a bit of a morbid theory, but I think that it has some merit, and honestly may have been possible. After Sirius was sentenced to his crimes, the whole wizarding world turned on him. He was immediately featured on the front cover of the Daily Prophet, and the whole wizarding world was exposed to Sirius Black, mass murderer. However, I feel like Sirius got no slack when it came to his sentencing, particularly as up until that point in time, he had lived a fairly normal life. Sirius began attending Hogwarts in the year 1971, along with fellow marauders Peter Pettigrew, James Potter, and Remus Lupin. He was a good student, though a bit of a troublemaker, and was sorted into Gryffindor House when he started at the school. After graduating, he joined the Order of the Phoenix, which was founded by Albus Dumbledore, and helped with the opposition against Lord Voldemort and the Death Eaters. So, my question is, how could everyone truly believe that Sirius was a murderer? He had spent a considerable amount of time with his fellow Order members, and during his time at Hogwarts, surely would have made an impression on some of his professors. So, why did everyone suddenly believe that he had the capacity to murder 12 Muggles and his lifelong friend? Unfortunately, when Sirius was initially caught for his alleged crimes, he sort of sealed his own fate, when instead of pleading his innocence, his first reaction was to burst out laughing. With the pile of dead Muggles and the index finger of his friend in front of him, Sirius should have taken his situation very seriously. But, in times of extreme stress, it's hard to predict how one will react. Unable to process everything that had just happened, Sirius had a mental breakdown. The Potters were dead. He had just witnessed the murder of 12 Muggles. His childhood friend, Pettigrew, had changed allegiance, and from that point onward he would have to live, knowing the recommendation that he'd made to the Potters to make Pettigrew secret keeper. Sirius was possibly the main reason that the Potters had died, and he couldn't process everything that had just happened. Sirius was of course the initial choice for the Potter secret keeper, a witch or wizard designated to hide a secret, secured by the Fidelius charm, which conceals the secret inside of the secret keeper's soul. However, Pettigrew was later chosen as secret keeper in his place, as Sirius felt that he would have been a more likely target for Voldemort. Lily and James only made you secret keeper because I suggested it. I thought it was the perfect plan. Voldemort would be sure to come after me. Would never dream they'd use a weak, talentless thing like you. It must have been the finest moment of your miserable life, telling Voldemort you could hand him the Potters. However, this was a fatal error on Sirius's part, as Pettigrew, after being made secret keeper, showed his true colours. Because Sirius and the Potters had never revealed to anyone else the change in secret keeper, from the outside it honestly looked as though Sirius had first given up the Potters' location to Voldemort, then murdered a bunch of Muggles, then killed Pettigrew. Things didn't look good for Sirius, and when Fudge showed up to the scene of the crime and witnessed Sirius laughing, he looked like a crazed, murderous lunatic that was truly befitting of the crimes that had just been committed. His laughter rid him of whatever shred of innocence he may have otherwise had, and he was sent to Azkaban without a trial. This is unheard of, particularly because Death Eaters, who'd committed equally horrible crimes, even got a trial. Given that Sirius was, in the eyes of Fudge, unequivocally and indisputably guilty for his crimes, and the fact that he was the last known secret keeper, it's no surprise that he went to Azkaban for 12 years. However, What I always found interesting was that Dumbledore didn't step up and defend Sirius. Sure, Dumbledore didn't know about the change in Secret Keeper, but he did know Sirius. And if there's one thing that Dumbledore exhibits well in this series, it's his ability to read people and read situations. I find it hard to believe that Albus Dumbledore was truly convinced that Sirius was guilty. Not only that, but Dumbledore possesses the means to figure out whether he's innocent or not. Dumbledore is portrayed in the books and films as being a skilled legilimens, which means that he's essentially able to read people's minds. He does this first with Kreacher in the Order of the Phoenix. "And Kreacher told you all this and laughed?" he croaked. "He did not wish to tell me," said Dumbledore, "but I am a sufficiently accomplished legilimens myself to know when I'm being lied to, and I persuaded him to tell me the full story before I left for the Department of Mysteries." Dumbledore was also the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, which gave him access to Azkaban inmates. With this access, we know that he also used legilimency on Morfin Gaunt in the past. Yes, but it took a great deal of skilled legilimency to coax it out of him. So my question is, couldn't he have easily just gone to Azkaban and found out the truth? Dumbledore's word was enough to have Snape's name cleared, so surely if he had found out the truth, he could have done something for Sirius. Didn't he owe that to him? I think that the potential morbid reality of this situation is that Dumbledore knew that Sirius was innocent all along, but allowed him to be imprisoned in Azkaban because he felt that his imprisonment would be better for the Wizarding world as a whole. Here's why. Sirius Black was Harry's godfather, and being so close to the Potters would have likely taken young Harry under his wing after the death of his parents. If he were given a trial, I think that it's highly likely that Sirius would have claimed guardianship over Harry. I also think that it's particularly interesting that Sirius never got a trial at all, particularly as other Death Eaters did. It seems almost too convenient that he never got a chance to speak his case, as though one of his allies had persuaded the Ministry that he was sure of Black's guilt. Dumbledore. But Dumbledore never wanted Sirius to rot in Azkaban for no reason. He had a purpose, and this purpose came down to baby Harry and what Harry would need to achieve over the course of his lifetime. First of all, if Sirius had taken guardianship of Harry, he would have never lived with the Dursleys, and though they were awful to Harry, it may have actually kept him alive. Dumbledore explains this himself. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort. He shed her blood, but it lives on in you and her sister. Her blood became your refuge. You need return there only once a year, but as long as you can still call it home, there he cannot hurt you. Your aunt knows this. I explained what I had done in the letter I left, with you, on her doorstep. She knows that allowing you house room may well have kept you alive for the past 15 years. And that's why Harry lived with the Dursleys, not because they provided him with a loving home and because they were the best fit for him, but because of his bloodline. Harry's aunt Petunia was of course the sister of Harry's mother, Lily Potter. Because Petunia was Harry's blood relative, people held the belief that Lily's act of sacrificial protection would continue on and be transmitted through Petunia. So even though the Dursleys treated Harry like trash, in a tragic turn of events, it was actually still safer with the Dursleys than with anyone else. Sirius would have been a great father figure to Harry, and Harry would have enjoyed a wonderful upbringing, but he would have never been completely safe. Under the roof of the Dursleys, Harry had nothing to worry about, or more specifically, Dumbledore had nothing to worry about. Harry was the chosen one, and he needed to grow old so that the prophecy could come true, and he could overpower and defeat Lord Voldemort. Dumbledore, who lived his life pursuing the best interest of the Wizarding world as a whole, rather than the best interest of individuals, raised Harry like a pig for slaughter, knowing that he would eventually die. In order for Harry to fulfill the prophecy and act as a martyr, Dumbledore felt that Harry would need to be raised under harsh conditions, and at the Dursley residence, harsh conditions Harry faced. Had Harry been raised by Sirius, he would have grown up as a famous, strong, confident, and independent young man, and perhaps not the man and martyr that the Wizarding world would end up needing. Dumbledore manipulated Harry from day one, for the greater good, and Sirius Black would have only gotten in his way. Though Dumbledore didn't dislike Sirius, in Dumbledore's eyes his imprisonment was essential to secure the fate of the Wizarding world.
And that's it for this video. If you've made it this far, then bravo, and thank you very much for watching. If you want more of these compilation style videos, let me know in the comment section below. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams, and to forget to live.